Cale hit the ground before he heard the sound of his own body falling. The mud came up fast, cold and thick, and it pressed into his cheek and his palms and his knees all at once, the way ground only does when someone has thrown you hard enough that the earth itself has no time to receive you gently. He lay there for a moment, one breath, two. The crowd around him did not make a single noise for those 2 seconds, and those 2 seconds were the worst of the entire evening, because silence in a wolf pack does not mean sympathy. It means the audience is deciding whether what they just witnessed was worth their laughter or their contempt. They decided on laughter. It started at the back, the way it always does with crowds that are unsure of themselves. A snicker first, from someone who wanted to laugh but needed permission. Then it rippled forward, gaining confidence, until the whole clearing was loud with it, and Cale, still face down in the mud at the edge of the trial circle, pressed his fingers into the cold earth and breathed through his nose and said nothing. He was 17 years old. He had been standing in trial circles since he was 14. He had been falling in them almost as long. The pack trials were held 3 times a year at the edge of the territory, in a clearing the older wolves called the Proving Ground, though no one was ever certain what exactly was being proved there, given that the outcomes were almost always decided before anyone set foot in the circle. The senior wolves sat on a long bench to the north side. The pack alpha, a large, broad man named Gareth, sat at the center of the bench with his arms folded and his eyes carrying that particular kind of tiredness that comes not from lack of sleep but from long years of indifference. He had not always been that way. The older wolves, the ones who remembered the pack before Gareth took the alpha seat, said he had once been a fair man. That was a long time ago. Fairness, in Cale's observation, was the first thing powerful men gave up when the world stopped asking them to demonstrate it. To Gareth's right sat his eldest son, Dren. Dren was 22 years old and had the kind of build that suggested he had spent his whole life being told his size was the most important thing about him. He was wide across the shoulders and narrow in the eyes, and he smiled often, but only in the way that people smile when they want to make sure you understand that what is happening to you is intentional. He had thrown Cale into the mud. He had done it in the middle of a speed drill which technically required the participants to shift and sprint across a measured distance, but Dren had stopped the drill halfway through by walking directly into Cale's path and stepping on the back of his heel so that his stride collapsed and his body went sideways and his legs had no time to save him. The wolves on the bench had seen it. Gareth had seen it. No one said anything. Cale got up. He always got up. That was the one thing he had learned over 3 years of standing in circles where the outcome was predetermined. The getting up was the only piece of the trial that still belonged entirely to him. He straightened his back. He turned to face the bench. He did not look at Dren. He looked at Gareth because it was Gareth who had the authority to stop what was happening, and looking at Gareth directly was Cale's way of registering without words that he knew whose choice this was. Gareth looked back at him for exactly 2 seconds, then he looked away. That was its own kind of answer. Cale's name appeared at the bottom of every trial performance list. It had appeared there for 3 years. The official reason, the one written in the pack records and read out at the quarterly assessments, was that Cale was a late bloomer, an omega-adjacent wolf whose physical development was delayed, whose shift was inconsistent, whose stamina scores fell below pack average, whose coordination during group drills was a liability rather than an asset. Those were the official words. The unofficial version, the one that moved through the pack the way water moves through cracks in stone, was simpler. Cale was weak. Cale was scrawny. Cale was the kind of wolf a pack keeps around not because he contributes anything, but because throwing him out formally would require paperwork, and it was easier to just let the trials do the work eventually. He did not think of himself as weak. He also did not argue the point. There was a particular kind of intelligence that came from years of being underestimated, and it was this: you learned to watch. When you were not a threat, people forgot you were in the room. When people forgot you were in the room, they stopped performing and started simply behaving, and behavior, real behavior, was far more informative than anything anyone said in public. Cale had been watching his pack for 3 years the way a person watches a complicated machine, learning where the gears catch, where the pressure builds, where the whole thing might one day seize up and crack. He knew things about this pack that the senior wolves had forgotten they had done. He knew which alliances were performed and which were genuine. He knew which wolves patrolled the borders faithfully, and which ones turned back early and filed false reports. He knew that the pack's east border had a gap in its patrol pattern every 3rd Wednesday because two of the assigned wolves were taking that night for themselves, and had been for over a year, and no one above them had ever noticed because the senior wolves never walked that section of border themselves. He filed this information away. He did not use it, not yet. He was 17, and the only luxury available to someone in his position was patience. After the trial, he was assigned cleanup duty for the proving ground, which was the traditional punishment assigned to the wolf who performed worst in the day's drills. Cleanup duty meant collecting the marker flags, restacking the obstacle equipment, and raking the mud at the edge of the circle back into something that looked even, so the ground would be ready for the next session. He did this alone in the late afternoon, while the rest of the pack made their way back toward the settlement. He was raking the last section of mud when he became aware that someone was watching him from the tree line. He did not turn immediately. He continued raking. He counted his breaths. He let his peripheral vision work, the way his grandmother had taught him when he was very small, before the suppressants, before the silence, before all of it. He swept the rake left, then right, and as he swept right he let his gaze travel with it casually, as though he were simply watching his own work, and at the far edge of the tree line he found what he was looking for. His grandmother, Vera, stood at the edge of the pines. She was a small, narrow woman in her late 60s, with white hair that she kept braided close to her head and eyes that had never in his memory looked surprised by anything. She wore a brown coat that was too heavy for the weather, and boots that she had worn for so many years that they had shaped themselves entirely to the particular way she stood, slightly forward on the balls of her feet, as though she were always about to walk somewhere but was giving herself one more moment to decide whether it was worth it. She was watching him, not with pity, not with the particular strained smile people used when they were watching someone they felt sorry for and wanted to communicate compassion without getting involved. She was watching him with something that was much harder to read, something that Cale had spent years trying to name and had never quite managed. She turned before he could catch her eye. That was the strange part, not that she left. She had come to watch his trials before and left without approaching him, which he had decided long ago was her way of making sure he was still standing without making that observation into a conversation he would have to carry home. But this time she turned away first. She turned before he looked up, as though she had known he was about to catch her watching, and something about turning away in that moment was easier than meeting his eyes. He stood with the rake in his hands and watched the empty space where she had been. He was not hurt by it, he was puzzled. Vera was not a woman who flinched from things. She was not a woman who turned away from hard truths or uncomfortable conversations. She had raised him for 7 years after his parents were gone, and in those 7 years she had told him more hard truths than most people heard in a lifetime, and she had delivered all of them with the same quiet directness, the same steady gaze. She had never once looked away from him first. He finished raking. He stacked the equipment in the storage shed at the edge of the clearing. He walked back to the fringe quarters alone, along the narrow path that ran between the eastern pines and the boundary of the main settlement, the path that the Omega wolves and the unranked and the pack adjacent used, so that their passage through the territory did not inconvenience the ranked wolves who used the main road. He had walked this path so many times that he knew every tree, every root that crossed it, every place where the ground dipped and collected water after rain. He knew the smell of it, the particular mix of pine resin and damp earth, and the faint, always-present scent of the settlement's cooking fires, carried here by the west wind. He had walked it in every season, in the dark, in the early morning, in the middle of the day when the light came through the pines in long, broken bars and made the path look like something from a story. He had walked it angry and tired, and sometimes both at once, and in all those walks he had come to a slow and private understanding that the path was its own kind of teacher. You learned patience walking a path that was not the one you had been meant to walk. You learned to look at what was actually around you, rather than what you had been told to expect. He was thinking about Vera's turn back when he reached the fringe quarters. The fringe quarters were a cluster of low buildings at the outermost edge of the pack's settled territory, separated from the main settlement by a stretch of open ground that served no practical purpose but communicated, clearly and without words, that there was a distance between these buildings and the ones that mattered. The buildings themselves were not bad. They were solid, well-made, and the one Cale occupied was even comfortable in a spare way, with a fire pit that drew well and a sleeping mat that was thick enough to keep the cold from the ground away. He had made it his own over the years, in the way that people who have very few possessions make spaces their own, through arrangement and habit and the small, accumulated weight of daily use. He pushed open the door and went inside. He set the rake down against the wall out of habit, even though he had left it at the storage shed and was not carrying a rake. His hands remembered the motion anyway. He stood in the middle of the room for a moment with nothing in his hands, which was the particular kind of strange that came after long physical effort, when your body was still organizing its own tiredness. He went to the corner, he moved the sleeping mat, he did not open the chest beneath it. He simply crouched there with his hand resting on its surface, the iron cold against his palm, and looked at the key that hung from a cord around his neck, and thought about his grandmother's back turning against the tree line, and the way the silence in the clearing had stretched out after he fell, and the way Gareth had looked at him for exactly 2 seconds and then looked somewhere else. Then he put the mat back over the chest, straightened up, and went to start a fire. He would eat, he would sleep. He would report for his patrol shift at dawn, which was the shift no one else wanted, which was also the shift that covered the east border on the 3rd Wednesday rotation, which meant he would be on the stretch of boundary that was currently unguarded, because 2 of the ranked wolves had been quietly helping themselves to a free night every 3 weeks for over a year. He did not plan anything specific for that patrol. He simply noted that it was coming and that he would be awake for it, and that he was, among other things, very good at tracking things that moved through territory they were not supposed to be in. He was not planning. He was simply paying attention, the way he always did, quietly, without anyone noticing, in the way that very few people notice a still thing until it moves. That night he slept without difficulty, which had always been one of his better qualities. Whatever tomorrow was going to ask of him, he would need the sleep. The mud had been cold and the fall had jarred his shoulder, and the laughter of the pack had been the specific kind of loud that leaves a faint ringing in the ears afterward, not from volume but from meaning. He was not bitter about the laughter. He had stopped being bitter about it around the same time he had stopped being surprised by it, which was the same time he had begun to understand that the pack's contempt for him was not actually about him at all. It was about a story they had decided to tell, a story in which his smallness and his silence and his unremarkable performance at trials confirmed something they needed confirmed, which was that the order of things in this pack was correct and natural, and not something that needed to be questioned. He had let them tell that story. He had been letting them tell it for 3 years. He had been patient and watchful and quiet, and he had gathered, piece by piece, all the information that his invisibility allowed him to gather, and he had stored it in the same careful way he stored everything, without display, without waste. The chest under his sleeping mat was iron. It was very old. The lock on it was not the kind of lock that required force to open. It required a specific key, and the specific key hung around Cale's neck, and had hung there since he was 4 years old, and the chest had been sitting under his sleeping mat for 3 years, and in 3 years he had not opened it, because the person who had given him the key had also told him that he would know when it was time. He was beginning to think that the time was getting closer. He pressed his fingers against the cord at his neck, briefly, the way a person checks that something is still there before sleep, and then he let his hand fall and he closed his eyes and he listened to the sound of the wind moving through the pines at the edge of the fringe quarter, and after a while he was asleep. Outside, the pack settled into its evening routines. Fires were lit, meals were eaten. Stories were told, and in at least one of those stories, someone described the way the scrawny wolf had hit the ground at the trials today, and the people listening laughed, and the story grew a little in the telling, the way stories do when the person telling them needs the embarrassment of the subject to be large enough to justify the size of their laughter. Cale slept through all of it. He was good at that too. In the morning, he rose before the sky was fully light, dressed in the dark, and stepped out into the cold pre-dawn air with his patrol kit already in hand, because he had learned long ago that preparation was the only form of confidence available to someone who had nothing else to show for themselves yet. He walked the east path alone. His breath made small white clouds in the air ahead of him. He moved quietly, not because he was sneaking, but because the morning was quiet and it seemed like the right thing to match. On the east border he found exactly what he expected, a gap. An hour-long gap in the scent markers where 2 wolves should have been, the space between their last logged position and their next one wide enough to walk a stranger through unnoticed. He crouched at the edge of it, he looked at the ground, he looked at the trees, he breathed in slowly, cataloging what the air was telling him. Then he stood up and walked the gap himself, silent and methodical, because if no one else was going to protect this piece of ground, then he was, and that was simply the shape of this particular morning. He was small and covered in yesterday's mud still dried at the edges of his sleeves, and the pack thought he was nothing. He was beginning to think that was the most useful thing about him. The rogue wolf came from the north. Cale smelled it before he saw any sign of it, the way he always smelled things before other people saw them, which was one of the several abilities he had learned to keep completely to himself. The scent hit him mid-patrol, carried on the early wind from the direction of the old creek that marked the pack's northern edge. It was faint. It was 3 hours old at least. But it was there, sharp and foreign and deliberate in the way that a thing left by something intelligent is always slightly different from a thing left by an animal passing through. He stopped walking. He stood very still. He let the wind come to him rather than moving toward it, because moving toward a scent changes the scent, and Cale had never had the luxury of wasting information. The rogue had crossed the creek somewhere between the two standing pines that served as the northern markers, the ones the pack called the gates, though they were not gates, and there was nothing physical stopping anyone from walking between them. They were simply the understood boundary. The understood boundary meant something in a territory with a strong pack behind it. The understood boundary meant considerably less when the pack was busy laughing at trials and skipping patrols. He tracked the crossing point with his eyes, reading the ground the way his grandmother had taught him when he was 9 years old, reading it the way she said his grandfather had once tracked game across dry rock with nothing but the angle of crushed grass and the weight distribution of footprints in the dust. His grandfather, a man Cale had never met, about whom Vera said almost nothing, but in the precise way that people say almost nothing about things that matter more than everything else. The rogue had not come in to cause harm. That was the first thing the track told him. Something that came in to cause harm moved differently, lower to the ground, slower, with the stops and starts of something assessing its target. This had moved with confidence, with purpose, in a direct line from the creek to a point approximately 40 meters inside pack territory where it had stopped for several minutes, and then departed the same way it had come. It had come to look at something specific. Cale stood where the rogue had stood and looked in the direction the tracks suggested the rogue had been facing. He was looking at the fringe quarters, specifically at the cluster of buildings on the eastern side where the lowest-ranked pack members lived, where Cale lived. He thought about this for a long time, standing in the place where something unknown had stood and looked at the same buildings he walked toward every evening. Then he committed the scent to memory, the way he committed everything to memory, deeply and without hurry, until it was as reliable in his mind as a written record. He did not report the crossing. This was a decision he made quietly and with full awareness of what he was deciding. The right thing to do, the packlaw thing to do, was to mark the location, note the time, estimate the direction, and file a border incursion report with the senior patrol officer before the next review. That was the process. That was what the process was for. The process would result in the report going to Dren, who was the current senior patrol officer, and who would do exactly two things with it. Use it as evidence that the east border was failing because the Omega wolves who patrolled it were incompetent, and bury the part about the gap left by the two ranked wolves who had been quietly abandoning their shift every third Wednesday for over a year. The rogue incursion would become a story about Cale's failure. The system failure that had made it possible would disappear. So he did not report it. Instead, he memorized the scent. He marked the entry point in his own head, with compass directions and landmark references that he would have been able to find again in the dark and in any weather. He noted the date, the time, the weather conditions, the wind direction, the state of the ground, the approximate age of the tracks. He noted all of it the way he noted everything, in the running private record that existed nowhere except in the particular quality of his attention. Then he finished his patrol and went home. He did not tell anyone. 3 days later, on a different section of the north border, he found a second set of marks. Same scent, same deliberate movement pattern, same careful, intelligent approach and withdrawal. This time the rogue had come closer, stopping at a point that was barely 20 meters from the edge of the fringe quarter buildings, and it had left something. Cale crouched over the spot for a long time. It was not a marking in the threat sense, not the aggressive territorial statement that a wolf makes when it wants a fight. It was something older than that, something he recognized from the very back of his memory, from a time when he was small enough that his grandmother had carried him on her back through the forest, and the world had been all smell and sound and the warmth of her coat against his face. It was a signal, a recognition marker. The kind of thing left between wolves who know each other, or who know of each other, from a time before the current arrangement of packs and territories had been established. He sat back on his heels and looked at it. Something knew he was here, something had come to see for itself. Something had found what it was looking for and marked the location, and then left again without confrontation, which was not the behavior of a threat. It was the behavior of something that was waiting. He put his hand over the mark without touching it. He felt the heat of the ground beneath his palm, which was the natural warmth of soil in the late morning, nothing unusual. He felt his own heartbeat in his fingertips. He breathed in once deeply and held the scent in the back of his throat the way you hold a word you have not heard in years, trying to determine whether you recognize it. He thought he did, he could not explain why. He stood up, he went back to the fringe quarters. He sat on the floor of his small room with his back against the wall, and his knees drawn up and the key at his throat warm between his fingers, and he thought about his grandmother standing at the tree line with her back turned, and the chest under the mat, and the letters inside it that he had never read, addressed in handwriting he did not recognize, sealed with a mark he had never been shown the meaning of. He thought, something is moving toward this. Something has been moving toward this for a long time, from a long way away, and it is close enough now to see the buildings where he slept. He thought, perhaps it was time to understand what he was carrying. He did not open the chest that day either, he was patient. That was the thing about patience that most people did not understand. It was not the same as waiting. Waiting was passive, patience was active. You were paying attention the entire time. You were gathering information. You were not sitting still because you had nothing to do. You were sitting still because moving too soon would cost you everything that stillness had earned. He went to see his grandmother. Vera lived not in the fringe quarters but in the old settlement, the original cluster of structures that had stood at the base of the eastern slope before the current pack claimed the territory and built their own buildings over the newer flatter ground to the west. The old settlement was not forbidden to anyone, technically. It was simply not where anyone went, because it was inconvenient and old and slightly outside the defined territory in a way that no one had ever formally resolved. Vera had been living there for 20 years, and in 20 years no one from the current pack hierarchy had ever come to ask her to leave, perhaps because they sensed, in the way that even powerful people sometimes sense things they cannot articulate, that asking Vera to leave a place she had chosen to occupy would be a conversation that ended in their own embarrassment. He walked the 40 minutes through the forest with his hands in his jacket pockets, and his eyes moving as they always moved, steady and peripheral, recording the world around him without making a performance of it. He crossed the old creek at the stepping stones and came up the eastern slope through the birch stand that had gone full gold this season, the light coming through the leaves in a way that made the whole hillside look as though it were lit from somewhere underneath. He had walked this path since he was a child. The path had not changed. He had changed year by year in ways that the path could not mark and the pack had not noticed. Vera was in her garden when he arrived, which was not a surprise. Vera was almost always in her garden, not because she was particularly devoted to gardening, but because her garden occupied the space directly in front of her house, and she was a person who liked to be outside when she was thinking, and she was almost always thinking. She was crouched over a bed of late herbs with a small knife in her hand, and she did not look up when he came through the gate, which was also not a surprise, because Vera had always been able to tell who was approaching by the sound of their walk long before they were close enough to see. He sat on the low stone wall beside the gate and watched her work. She cut herbs the way she did everything, with precise, economical movements that never wasted effort, the same way she talked, and the same way she looked at things she was trying to understand. He said, "Someone has been walking the north border." She did not stop cutting, she said, "I know." He waited, she cut 3 more stems and laid them in the basket at her knee. Then she sat back on her heels, the way he had sat back on his heels at the marking, and she looked at the herbs in her basket with the expression she used when she was deciding how much of a thing to say. He said they came close to the fringe quarter buildings, they left a mark, it was not a threat mark. "No," she said, "it would not be. You know who it is." It was not a question. She heard it not as a question because she looked up then, which was the thing she did when a statement landed true and she was acknowledging it. Her eyes were the color of old wood, dark brown with gray in them, and they looked at him with that expression he had been trying to name for years, the one that was not pity and not worry and not the ordinary parental kind of love that people showed with warmth. It was something harder than any of those things, something that knew a great deal and had been carrying that knowledge for a very long time. "Sit down properly," she said. "You look like you're planning to bolt." He moved off the wall and sat on the garden bench, which was an old split-log bench that had been there since before he could remember, and was slightly uncomfortable in the way that old things always are when they were built for function, and not rest. She set her knife down in the basket and brushed the soil from her hands, and came to sit on the other end of the bench with several inches between them, the way she always sat, as though she understood that what she was about to say would need space around it. She said, "The key around your neck opens a chest." "I know that. The chest holds letters." "I know that too." She was quiet for a moment. A bird moved through the birch stand on the slope above them, and they both heard it, and neither of them looked at it, which was the kind of thing you noticed only when you had known someone for a very long time. She said, "The letters are from your father." He had suspected this. He had suspected it for a long time. He had not let himself be certain of it, because certainty about something you did not fully understand yet was a way of closing off the understanding before it had finished arriving. He had kept it in the space between suspicion and knowledge, which was a hard space to hold but the right one. He said, "He is alive." It also was not a question. Vera pressed her lips together briefly. Then she said, "He is very much alive. He has been alive all the years you have been here, and he has been watching, and he has been waiting in the same way that you have been waiting for the right time." Cale looked at his hands in his lap. He turned them over once and looked at the palms, at the calluses from patrol work and the faint line of yesterday's mud still in the crease at the base of his thumb. He had his mother's hands, or so he had been told by Vera, who was the only one who had known his mother and who spoke about her rarely and with great care. He said, "Why did you turn away at the trials?" Vera was quiet for a long time, long enough that the bird in the birch stand finished whatever it was doing and moved on, and the sound of the forest resettled itself around them. Then she said, "Because I have watched them do this to you for 3 years, and I have watched you hold your ground for 3 years, and yesterday when he came down in the mud the way he did, I could not look at your face in that moment. Not because I was ashamed of you." She stopped. She smoothed the edge of her sleeve with her thumb once. "Because I was afraid of what I would see when you got up. I was afraid I would see that it had finally broken something, and if it had, I would have walked into that clearing, and I am an old woman, and that would have been the end of everything we have waited for." Cale looked at her. "It had not broken anything," he said. "I know," she said. "I turned around too soon. By the time I was back in the trees, you were already on your feet." He thought about that, about her standing in the pines, listening for the sound of him getting up, and the relief she must have carried home with her, and how that relief was exactly the shape of all the years she had fed him his meals and kept his secret and said very little about any of it, and watched him go to trials and come back still standing. He said, "Open the chest with me." She looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time in his memory her expression was fully readable. It was not the hard, knowing thing it usually was. It was something simpler. It was the face of someone who had been carrying a very heavy thing alone for a very long time and had just been offered help. She said, "Tonight." He nodded once. He stayed for the afternoon. She made tea, the kind she had always made, from herbs she grew herself, bitter and strong, with a faint sweetness at the back of it that he had never been able to identify and had always meant to ask about and never quite had. They sat in the garden while the light went from afternoon gold to the long, thin light of the early evening, and they talked about small things, the kind of small things that are really not small at all, but that people who love each other carefully use as a way of being together without having to be formal about it. She asked him about the patrol schedule. He told her about the gap in the east border rotation and the 2 wolves who had been using it. She listened without surprise, because Vera almost never looked surprised, but he saw her note it in the way she noted things, with a single small nod that meant she was adding it to something she was already holding. He did not ask her again about his father. He would have time for that tonight. He was patient. He had always been patient. He had been patient so long that it had become the truest thing about him, more reliable than his size or his trial scores or any of the things the pack used to define him. He was patient the way a river is patient. He did not force things. He simply kept moving in the direction he was going, and he had learned, from long study and longer watching, that rivers eventually got where they were going even when the ground pushed back. The sun went behind the ridge. The garden went into shade. Vera stood and picked up her basket and walked toward the house, and he followed, and neither of them said anything about where they were going or what they were about to do. They did not need to. It had been a long time coming, and they both knew it, and some things only need to be said once to be understood forever after in silence. He carried the chest from the fringe quarters under his arm. It was heavier than it looked. It had always been heavier than it looked. He walked the dark path back through the birch stand with the chest under one arm and his other hand at his side, and his eyes on the path and his mind very quiet, the way his mind always went quiet when something important was approaching. The fire in Vera's hearth was burning by the time he arrived. She had set 2 chairs facing each other across the low table. She had poured 2 cups of the bitter tea. She was sitting in her chair with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on him as he came through the door, and she did not say anything. He set the chest on the table between them. He sat down. He reached into the collar of his shirt and took hold of the cord and pulled the key out over his head. He held it in his palm for a moment. It was small and very old, made from iron that had gone almost black with age and use, and it was warm from being against his skin. He put it in the lock. He looked at his grandmother. She looked back at him. He turned the key. The vote was held on a Tuesday. Cale did not know about it until it was over, which was how Dren had designed it. The formal process for initiating a culling chase required 3 days of open deliberation, during which any pack member had the right to speak in defense of the wolf being considered for removal. 3 days gave the pack the appearance of fairness. 3 days also gave Dren enough time to speak privately to each of the 12 senior wolves before the formal session opened, which meant that by the time the session began, the 12 votes were already cast in the minds of the 12 people who held them, and the 3 days of open deliberation were a performance, not a process. Cale had not known about the private conversations either until after they happened. But he had sensed something shifting in the pack the week before the vote was announced, a change in the way certain wolves looked at him when he passed, a particular kind of deliberate non-eye contact that was different from the ordinary ignoring he had learned to navigate. Ordinary ignoring was indifferent. This had a quality of intention to it, the way a person looks away from a thing they have already decided to do something about. He had been tracking the shift the way he tracked everything, in his quiet, methodical, invisible way, and he had been forming a guess about what it meant, but he had not been certain until the morning of the formal session, when the pack summons was left on the door of the fringe quarter building where he slept. The summons was handwritten, on pack stationery, in the formal language that the pack used for official proceedings. It informed him that his continued membership in the pack was under review. It informed him that the review session was scheduled for the following afternoon and that his attendance was required. It informed him, in the polite language of official documents that are carrying bad news, that the pack council had concerns about his contribution level, his performance metrics, and his long-term value to the group, and that these concerns would be formally addressed in the session. He read it twice, folded it, put it in his jacket pocket and went to morning patrol. He walked the east border with the folded paper in his pocket and the cold morning air against his face, and he did not feel what he had expected to feel when this moment came, which was dread. He felt instead a clarity, the kind of clarity that comes when something you have been anticipating for a long time finally arrives, and the anticipating is over and there is only the thing itself. He had been expecting this. Not in a defeated way, not in the way of someone who expected bad things because they believed bad things were all they deserved. In the way of someone who had been reading the patterns correctly and had known for months that the patterns were building to this, and had been preparing, in his quiet and unhurried way, for the fact of it. He had not been preparing to fight the vote. There was nothing to fight. The vote was already decided. The 3 days of formal deliberation were irrelevant. He knew that with the same certainty with which he knew the gap in the east border rotation and the rogue wolf's scent and the weight of the chest under his sleeping mat. What he had been preparing for was what came after. The session was held in the pack's main hall, a long building with a high roof and benches down both sides that served as the location for all formal pack business. Cale walked in through the main door at the appointed time and found every bench full, which surprised him slightly, not because it was unusual for sessions to be well attended, but because the level of attendance suggested that the pack had been informed of the purpose of the session in advance, which meant it had been circulated as a social event as much as a formal proceeding. They had come to watch. He sat in the chair that had been placed in the center of the hall, facing the council bench, and he looked at the hall around him calmly, taking attendance the way he took inventory of everything. He noted who was there. He noted where people were sitting. He noted who was sitting with whom, and in particular he noted who had chosen to sit in the forward rows, which were the rows from which you chose a seat if you wanted to be seen to be part of what was happening, and who had chosen the back benches, which was where you sat if you came because you felt you had to but did not want to be associated with the outcome. There were more people in the back benches than he had expected. That was interesting. Gareth sat at the center of the council bench, in the same posture he always occupied, arms folded, expression carrying that practiced indifference. To his right, Dren sat with one ankle on his knee in the way he always sat when he wanted to look relaxed, which was his way of communicating that whatever was happening was already resolved, and he was simply present for the formality of it. The senior pack advisor, an older woman named Louise, sat at the far end of the bench. Louise had been the pack advisor for 18 years. She had outlasted 2 previous alphas and the administration that preceded Gareth's, and had a reputation for operating in the spaces between formal authority and actual decision-making in ways that neither Gareth nor Dren had ever fully understood. She was looking at the table in front of her when Cale sat down. She did not look up. The deliberation session opened with the reading of Cale's performance record, which a junior officer read from a document in a voice that had the careful neutrality of someone who was aware that they were reading a document designed to end badly for someone in the room, and did not want to be personally associated with the ending. The record listed 3 years of below-average trial scores. It listed the patrol incidents where his reports had been questioned, not because his reports were inaccurate, which no one had been able to demonstrate, but because they sometimes identified issues that implicated ranked wolves, and those wolves had disputed the reports, and their disputes had been upheld by Dren, who was the senior patrol officer and whose opinion therefore carried more institutional weight than Cale's fact-based accounts. The record listed 2 formal complaints against him for the same category of thing, observing and recording something inconvenient. He sat and listened to the record and kept his hands loose in his lap. When the reading was finished, Dren spoke. He spoke in the measured, reasonable tone he used when he wanted to sound like a person being reluctant and fair, which was the tone he had clearly practiced in advance of this session. He said that the pack valued all its members. He said that no decision to remove a wolf from the community was taken lightly, and that this one had been considered at length over many weeks. He said that the pack's strength came from the strength of each individual member, and that a member who consistently performed below threshold was not, despite the pack's best wishes and efforts, serving the community they were part of. He paused at that point for the exactly correct amount of time to give the impression of reluctance. Then he said that the council, having reviewed the record and consulted with all relevant senior wolves, recommended that the culling chase be initiated. He said this directly and without drama, in the way of someone delivering a decision that has already been made and is simply completing the paperwork of making it official. There was a moment of quiet in the hall, not the same kind of quiet as at the trials. This quiet was different. It was uncomfortable in a way that the laughter at trials had never been, because it was an official hall and an official decision, and whatever discomfort people felt about it was now attached to a formal act, which was harder to walk away from than laughter at a clearing in the woods. Cale spoke before anyone else could fill the silence. He said quietly and without standing, "I have one question." Dren looked at him with the slight narrowing of eyes that was his version of surprise. Cale did not typically speak at these sessions. He had attended 2 previous performance reviews and had said nothing at either, which Dren had clearly incorporated into his model of how this session would go. "Which direction?" Cale said. Dren blinked. "What?" "The chase. Which direction do you want me to run?" There was a beat of silence. Then Dren's expression reorganized itself into the smile he used when he wanted to seem like he was being good-humored about something he found irritating. "That is decided at the time of the chase," he said. "As you would know if you had been paying attention during pack procedure training." "I have been paying attention to pack procedure training," Cale said pleasantly. "I have been paying attention to most things. I just want to know before we begin which direction you have in mind." The north border has some interesting properties right now. I thought you might want to consider the alternatives. Louise looked up from the table. It was a small movement, and Cale was perhaps the only person in the hall who caught it, because he had been watching Louise throughout the session in the careful, peripheral way he watched everything. She looked up and her eyes found him, and they were sharp in the way that old, intelligent eyes go sharp when they hear something they did not expect to hear. Dren had not caught it. Dren's gaze had gone slightly narrow again, the way it did when he was not following something and was deciding whether to admit it. "I am glad," Dren said, "that you seem to be taking this so lightly." "I am not taking it lightly," Cale said. "I am taking it very seriously. I simply want to be informed before it begins." Gareth unfolded his arms at that point, which was the first time he had moved in the session. He said flatly, "The chase will proceed to the west, toward the unbound wilds, as is traditional." "Thank you," Cale said. He said it in a tone that was completely ordinary, completely without challenge or sarcasm or defiance, the tone of someone who has received factual information they asked for. He nodded once to no one in particular, and then he looked at his hands in his lap briefly, and then he looked back at the council bench. "One more question," he said. "Is there anyone in this hall who would like to speak in my defense before the vote is formalized?" The question landed in the hall and sat there. He watched people not look at each other. He watched people look at their hands or the table or the floor, the particular set of not looking at things that meant they were actively avoiding the decision to speak, rather than genuinely having nothing to say. He counted the silence. He counted it all the way to 15. Louise did not speak. Nobody spoke. He said "thank you" again in the same ordinary tone. Then he stood up from the chair and walked out of the hall the same way he had walked in, through the main door, without hurrying, without looking back. Outside, the afternoon light was the thin, flat light of early winter, the kind that makes everything look slightly faded and exact at the same time. He stood on the step outside the hall for a moment and looked at the sky, which was pale and very clear, and breathed in the cold air. He was not surprised. He had known this was coming. He was not angry. He would be angry later, he suspected, at a time of his own choosing, when anger would be useful rather than simply loud. He was, right now, in the particular state of calm that came when the last uncertainty was gone. The chase was going to happen. It was going to happen in the direction of the unbound wilds, which Gareth had just told him because Cale had asked, and which Cale had wanted confirmed because the unbound wilds were a specific piece of geography that he had been thinking about for a specific reason for several weeks. He walked back to the fringe quarters. He had some preparation to do. The days before the chase were 3. Pack law required 3 days between the formal vote and the start of the chase to allow for appeals. No one was going to appeal on his behalf. He knew that. The 3 days were his. He used them entirely for what he needed to use them for, which was quiet, methodical preparation, conducted with the same economy of motion and the same invisibility that had served him through 3 years of being underestimated. He visited Vera on the first day. They did not spend long together. She had things to give him, and she gave them without ceremony, which was exactly right. A packet of dried provisions, small and dense, the kind that took up almost no space and lasted longer than they had any right to. A map hand-drawn on oilskin paper, showing the unbound wilds in a level of detail that no pack territory map had ever included, because no pack had ever thought it worth knowing in detail. The map had notes in the margins, in a handwriting that was not Vera's, and Cale studied the notes carefully without asking whose handwriting it was, because he already knew. He visited the east border gap on the second day, not to monitor it but to measure it again, to understand its exact size and shape, to record in his mind the precise dimensions of the thing no one else had bothered to record, because there was going to come a day when that measurement mattered, and he wanted to have it. On the evening of the second day, he went back to the fringe quarter building, and he opened the chest. He already knew what was inside, because Vera had shown him on the night he had turned the key and lifted the lid in her firelit house. He had not been ready to fully absorb it then. He was more ready now. He sat on the floor with the letters spread around him in the order in which they were meant to be read, which was not the order in which they had been stacked in the chest, and he read them, all of them, from the beginning. They were from his father. They had been written over 17 years, one for each year of Cale's life, beginning on the day of his birth. The first was short, the last was long. The ones in the middle were everything in between, practical and careful and full of the particular kind of love that knows it cannot be demonstrated directly, and so demonstrates itself through information instead, through preparation, through the careful laying of a path that a person could only walk when they were ready. He read them all the way through twice. The second reading was slower than the first, because the first reading was for the facts and the second was for the understanding, and the understanding took longer. He sat with the last letter in his hands for a long time after he had finished reading it. His name was not Cale, or rather Cale was his name, the name his grandmother had chosen for him when she had taken him in at the age of 4, the name she had used deliberately as a cover, as a protection, as the name of a wolf with no particular lineage and no particular significance, a name that would not be recognized, that would not alert anyone who might have been looking. His birth name was different, it was older. It was the name his father had chosen for him, and it was the kind of name that carried a history with it the way a river carries silt, invisibly, continuously, in its very nature. He pressed the last letter flat against the floor with both hands and looked at the wall of the fringe quarter-room where he had slept for 3 years, the plain wooden wall with the knot in the third plank from the left that he had stared at when he could not sleep, and he thought about all the things that had happened in this room, and the room was the same room it had always been, plain and adequate and slightly cold in the mornings, and he was not the same person he had been when he moved into it. He was still himself, he had not changed in any fundamental way. He was still quiet and patient and better at watching than at performing, but the frame around those things had shifted, the frame had become larger, and the larger frame changed the meaning of everything it contained. He put the letters back in the chest, in order this time. He locked the chest. He put the key back on its cord around his neck. He lay down on his sleeping mat with his arm across his eyes and breathed through the feeling of it, the large, complicated feeling that had no single name, the one that was somewhere between grief and anger and a kind of deep, slow recognition, the feeling of understanding at last the shape of a thing you have been living inside for your whole life without knowing the name of it. He slept eventually. He was good at sleeping when he needed to. It was another thing about him that the pack had never understood, this ability to rest in the middle of difficulty. They had taken it for indifference. It was not indifference. It was the practice of someone who had learned very young that the mind needed care the way a body did, that you could not run on empty, that the ability to be still was itself a form of strength. On the third day, the morning of the chase, he rose before dawn and dressed and ate, and went outside with the chest under his arm and the key at his throat, and the oilskin map in his inner jacket pocket. He was ready. Not because everything was resolved, it was not. Not because he knew exactly how the next days would go, he did not. He was ready because he had done everything it was possible to do in advance of a thing, and the rest would have to happen as it happened, and he was, at his core, someone who trusted the rest when the preparation was complete. He stood outside the fringe quarter building in the cold pre-dawn and looked at the sky. Somewhere across the territory, wolves were rising and preparing for the chase. Dren would be stretching and looking pleased with himself. Gareth would be sitting at his table with the patience of a man who had already moved on from this decision to the next one. The 12 senior wolves who had voted would be having their morning meals, most of them not thinking about Cale at all, because he had already slipped from their awareness the way things do when people have decided they are finished with them. Louise might be thinking about it. He was less certain about Louise. The sun began to show at the edge of the sky, a thin, pale light between the trees, and Cale watched it come and kept his hands in his pockets and breathed the cold morning air and said nothing at all, to no one, because there was nothing left to say before what was about to begin. The chase was coming. He was going to run. But he was going to run the way a person runs who knows where they are going, which is a very different thing from running away. They gave him a 10-minute head start, which was tradition. Cale had always thought that the head start was the cruelest part of the culling chase, not because 10 minutes of running made the outcome meaningfully different, but because it was framed as mercy when it was actually theater. 10 minutes communicated something. It said, "We are giving you a chance and you will not use it, and we all know you will not use it, and we are giving it to you anyway because we want it on record that we were fair." It was the kind of fairness that existed entirely for the benefit of the people demonstrating it. He used the 10 minutes precisely as well as he could, which was not by running as fast as possible in the direction of the unbound wilds, which would have been the instinct, the panicked instinct, the kind of instinct the pack expected and the tradition was designed to produce. He ran instead at a pace he could maintain without exhaustion, along the route he had memorized from the oilskin map, through the territory he knew best, staying in the areas where his own scent was most layered from weeks of patrol work, where the track was hardest to read cleanly. He did not try to cover his trail. Covering a trail was a way of telling the wolves following you that you knew they were following you and that you were afraid of being caught, and covering a trail left its own evidence of effort. He ran clean at a steady pace on a deliberate route, and he thought about what he knew. He knew the unbound wilds from the map. He knew them in the particular way you know a place from a very good map, which was not the same as knowing them from walking them but was considerably better than not knowing them at all. The wilds were not, in fact, what the pack believed them to be. The pack believed the unbound wilds were dead territory, unfriendly ground, borderland that had been abandoned because it could not support life. This belief had been passed down through the pack for as long as anyone currently in the pack could remember, and it had never been seriously questioned because it was convenient. If the unbound wilds were inhospitable, the pack did not need to think about them. They existed as a boundary, as a punishment destination, as the place you threatened people with when you wanted to communicate that you were sending them somewhere unrecoverable. The map said something different. The map, in the handwriting of his father, annotated with notes that were specific and practical and entirely without drama, said that the unbound wilds were not dead territory. They were complex territory. They were territory that required knowledge to navigate, that had water sources at non-obvious locations, that had shelter in places that did not announce themselves, that had pathways through its interior that could not be found by following any route that made intuitive geographic sense. They were territory that killed people who went in without knowledge and supported, quite well, people who went in with it. His father had been through them, more than once. The notes were the record of someone who knew the ground from walking it, not from studying it. He ran. Behind him, after the 10 minutes had elapsed, he heard the pack give the signal, a long call that carried through the morning air the way pack calls carried through cold air, clearly and far. He heard it without reacting to it physically, without the adrenaline response that it was designed to produce in the person being chased, because he had been expecting it and had been running for 10 minutes already and had his pace set and his breathing under control and his mind on the route ahead. He had figured out, somewhere in the first years of living in the fringe quarters, and being what the pack regarded as nothing, that panic was a luxury. Not in the sense that it was something pleasant or desirable, but in the sense that it was something you could only afford if you had enough safety around you to absorb the cost of impaired judgment. People with resources to fall back on could panic and recover. People without resources could not afford the gap in clarity that panic created. He had trained himself out of it the way you trained a muscle, which was by putting himself in situations that produced it and breathing through them until the instinct quieted and the thinking began again. He was breathing clearly now, he was thinking clearly, he was running steadily. The pack's pursuit split when they reached the first tree line, the way he had expected it to. Dren led the main group straight west, which was the logical direction, the direction Gareth had named in the session, the direction toward the unbound wilds boundary. A smaller group angled southwest, cutting off the obvious detour route. Cale knew this because he had been reading the pack's chase strategy for 3 years through the accounts of the 2 previous culling chases that had happened while he was in the pack, and because he had been listening, at patrol meetings, to the way Dren described pursuit dynamics when he was instructing the younger wolves. Dren's pursuit philosophy was built on prediction. He did not track the individual. He predicted where the individual was going and sent wolves to arrive there before them. It was an effective strategy. It was most effective against targets who had no particular geographic knowledge of the territory they were crossing and who ran on instinct toward open ground. Cale was not running toward open ground. He was running through a series of intersecting patrol corridors that he knew in precise detail, where his own scent was layered from weeks of use, staying in the zones where the ground was hardest and the scent track was most disrupted by the natural environment, taking turns that made no immediate geographic sense, but that the map had shown him resolved into a much more efficient approach to the wild's entry point than the direct route would have been. He ran for 2 hours before he stopped. He stopped at the base of a large oak that stood at the edge of the territory's western limit, one of the last trees before the ground opened into the wide, featureless stretch of dead-looking grassland that formed the visible edge of the unbound wilds. He pressed his back against the oak and breathed and listened. The pack calls had changed direction 3 times in the 2 hours, which told him that they had not found a clean track and were executing a grid search, which was Dren's fallback strategy when the prediction approach failed. A grid search was slower than a direct pursuit. It was also more thorough. He had perhaps 40 minutes before the grid reached this section. He looked at the grassland. It looked exactly the way the pack described it. Dead, flat, unwelcoming, with a quality of blankness that made the eyes slide off it without finding a feature to hold on to. That was, he now understood, intentional, not a product of the territory's nature but a product of its particular kind of visibility. The unbound wilds looked dead and empty on its edges because that was how it discouraged casual entry. You had to know where to go. You had to know that the flatness was a surface phenomenon, and that below and behind it there was structure, water, shelter, depth. He pulled the oilskin map from his jacket. He checked his position against the landmarks he had memorized. He found the entry point, a specific rock formation at the southwest edge of the grassland that did not look significant from any approach direction except the one his father's notes specified, a bearing of slightly north of due west, at a walking pace, counting steps. He folded the map back into his pocket and pushed away from the oak. He walked into the grassland. He counted steps as he walked. The grass was knee-high in places and patchy in others, dry and pale, with a sound underfoot that was between a crunch and a whisper. The sky above him was very clear and very cold, with the kind of blue that made the air feel thinner than it was. He walked at a steady pace, not running now, because running across open ground in full daylight was an invitation to be tracked visually from a distance, and walking at a measured pace in the same direction as the wind made a person harder to locate than their instincts usually told them. He counted 300 steps and stopped. He was standing in what looked, from any direction but the one he had arrived from, like undifferentiated grassland. From the direction he had arrived from, he could see that the ground in front of him dropped, not sharply. A gentle slope, almost invisible from the approach, that descended into a natural depression in the landscape, a hollow that was 10 meters below the flat of the grassland and invisible from outside until you were standing at its edge. In the hollow, the grass was different, green. Dry season or not, the depression collected enough groundwater to keep a circle of ground alive in the center of the apparent deadland. He went down the slope and sat in the green grass of the hollow and ate the first of the dried provisions from the packet Vera had given him, chewing slowly and looking up at the circle of sky framed by the lip of the depression around him. It was a very small circle of sky, but it was enough. He was inside the unbound wilds now. The pack called this territory unsurvivable. He was sitting in it eating a meal in the middle of a green hollow that the pack did not know existed, because the pack had not bothered to know anything about this place beyond the story they told about it. He stayed in the hollow for the rest of the day. Twice in the afternoon he heard pack calls distant from the eastern edge of the grassland. The calls had the particular quality of wolves who were searching for something they could not find, the frustration in them audible even at distance. He sat in his hollow and listened and ate a small amount more of the provisions and drank from the thin trickle of water that seeped along one edge of the depression, and he thought. He thought about his father's letters. He had read them twice in the fringe quarter room and he had them largely in memory, but there was one section of the last letter that he found himself returning to, not because it was the most important part, but because it was the part that had surprised him most. His father had not written about power or authority or bloodlines in the way that Cale had half expected. He had not written about the pack or about Gareth or about what was owed and what would be reclaimed. He had written about patience in a way that felt like looking into a mirror, in the way that a child sometimes sees a parent's gesture in their own hands and understands, for a moment, the depth of the inheritance. His father had written, "I spent 11 years waiting for the right time. You will know the right time because it will stop feeling like waiting and start feeling like moving. You have been still long enough. When it is time to move, move completely. Do not leave anything in the still position." He had read those words in the fringe quarter room, and something had shifted in him that had not gone back to where it was before. The second night in the wilds, he built a small fire in the hollow, shielded by the slope on all sides, invisible from outside. He was not worried about the pack finding the hollow that night. Their search pattern would not have covered the depth of the grassland before dark, and the cold would push them back to the settlement's edge for the night. The pack was not equipped for extended overnight pursuit. Dren's strategy relied on speed and prediction. Both required daylight and coordination. He sat by the fire and opened the oilskin map again, and studied the second and third day's route. The map described a path deeper into the wilds that passed through 3 specific waypoints, each of which had a notation beside it. The first notation said, "Water source, reliable year-round, 20 steps east of the boulder with the double peak." The second said, "Shelter site, low entrance, faces south, holds heat." The third notation was different from the others. It was written in a different ink, darker, as though it had been added later, as though his father had come back to the map at some point after the original writing to add something that had not been part of the plan when the map was first made. The third notation said, "They will know you here." He sat with that for a long time. The fire made small sounds in the hollow. The night was extremely still. No wind at all, which was unusual, and the stillness made the wilds feel closer, more present, as though the land itself was paying a particular kind of attention. He thought about the rogue wolf at the north border, the one who had come and looked and left a mark of recognition and not a mark of threat, the one who had come twice, the one whose scent he had memorized because it carried something older than a signal, something that pulled at the back of his memory in the way that sounds heard before full consciousness pull at a sleeping mind, present and meaningful but not yet locatable. He thought about what came after the wilds. His father's letters had described what came after with the same practical specificity with which they described everything else. The route, the timing, the contacts, the process. They had described it in a way that was designed to be executable, not a dream, a plan. The difference between those two things was exactly as large as people always underestimated. He had grown up understanding himself as someone who had nothing. No rank, no standing, no visible talent that the pack valued, no claim to anything beyond the fringe quarter room and the patrol shifts nobody else wanted. He had been so thoroughly defined by that nothing that even the people who cared for him, even Vera, had organized their care around the management of that nothing, around keeping him safe within it, around making sure the nothing did not become something worse. The letters from his father were the opposite of nothing. They were the most information-dense communication he had ever received, not because they were long, though the later ones were, but because every sentence carried weight. His father was a person who did not waste words, and Cale recognized that quality the way you recognize your own face in a window's reflection, startled and then steady. On the third day, he moved. He followed the map through the deep interior of the wilds, which was different from the edge territory, not dead but quiet, with a density of life that was subdued and horizontal rather than obvious ground-level growth and root systems, and the kind of birds that did not make large sounds. He found the first waypoint exactly where the map said it would be, the boulder with the double peak, and he drank from the water source and refilled the small container Vera had packed for him and moved on. He found the shelter site in the early afternoon, and he understood why it had been noted. It was a natural overhang in a limestone formation that the grassland had grown over and concealed almost entirely, the entrance barely visible even from the correct angle, the interior dry and protected and oriented precisely to collect the southern sun's warmth through the narrow gap at the front. Someone had used it before. The floor had been cleared and leveled in the deliberate way of human preparation. There was a small cache at the back wall, wrapped in oilskin that he had not been told about, that was not in his father's notes. He crossed the hollow with the cache in both hands and crouched at the shelter entrance, where the light was better, and unwrapped it. Inside the oilskin was a letter, short, recent, written in an ink that had not fully dried when it was wrapped. The handwriting was not the same as the other letters. It was a different hand entirely, neat and quick and slightly forward-leaning, the handwriting of someone who thought faster than they wrote and was always half a sentence ahead of the pen. The letter said, "I have been at your north border twice, you know that. The second time I left the recognition mark, which is how you know it was me and not a stranger. I am not a stranger. I have been watching your pack for 3 months. I am not here for your pack. I am here for you. There is a place at the center of the wilds that the old maps call the maw. Your father's map will show you the way. Go there tonight. Do not come before dark. The maw does not like arrivals in the light." It was signed with a single name, Oren. He turned the letter over, nothing on the back. He folded it carefully and put it in his inner pocket, where the oilskin map already was, and sat for a moment with his hands on his knees and his back against the overhang wall, looking at the narrow rectangle of afternoon sky visible through the shelter entrance. The maw. He found it in his father's map without difficulty, because his father had drawn it with more care than any other feature on the map, with more annotations, with more detail in the surrounding area. The maw was at the center of the wilds, exactly where the most dead-looking section of the deadland appeared to be, and on the map it was not a blank space but a very precisely drawn geographic feature, a ravine, a deep one, with walls that curved inward and a floor that the map did not show, as though the map had been made from above and no one had been inside to report on what was down there. He thought about the note, he thought about the cold and the coming dark, he thought about what it meant to have been watched for 3 months and not known it, and about what kind of watcher left recognition marks rather than threat marks, and about the sentence at the end, "The maw does not like arrivals in the light." He ate the remaining provisions in the shelter, he drank the last of the water. He sat in the shelter and watched the light change through the entrance, moving through its afternoon stages, going from the flat brightness of full day to the long, angled light of late afternoon, and then to the particular shade of gray gold that the sky went just before the sun dropped below the horizon. When the light went, he stood up. He folded the oilskin map and put it away. He did not need it anymore. He had the route to the maw in his head. He had memorized it the way he memorized everything, fully, quietly, without hurry. He walked out of the shelter into the cooling dark of the deep wilds. The stars were beginning to show overhead. The ground was firm under his feet. The air smelled like something alive, the complex, deep smell of land that had been undisturbed for a very long time, land that had not been hunted across or patrolled or claimed or argued over, land that simply existed in its own arrangement, on its own terms. He walked toward the center of it. He walked toward the maw. And somewhere to the east of him, in the settlement that had run him out 3 days ago, the pack was preparing for the formality of declaring the chase complete, which was what you did when the chase had run past its recovery window and the wolves you had sent to find the subject had come back without one. They would declare it complete. They would record it in the formal documents. They would move on to the next piece of business. They had decided he was finished. He was not finished. He was, in fact, only just beginning, which was the kind of thing you could only understand if you had been paying very close attention to what had been happening all along. He kept walking. The dark was not frightening. He had never been frightened of the dark, which was perhaps the one way in which his wolf nature had always expressed itself clearly, and without any suppression, this ease in the night, this comfort with seeing in the dark while being seen by almost no one. That, he thought, might be the most honest description of his whole life up to this point. Ease in the dark, invisible in the night, moving toward a place that the maps called the maw and everyone else called a warning. Moving toward it without hesitation. That was something. He heard the maw before he saw it. Not a sound exactly, more a quality of the air, a change in pressure, the way the atmosphere shifted when you were moving toward something large that displaced the environment around it. He had felt it once before, standing at the edge of a river in spring flood, the river 50 meters away and the air already carrying the weight of it, the sound below sound that told your body before your mind could confirm it that something significant was ahead. He slowed his pace without stopping, he breathed deliberately. The ground under his feet had changed, had gone from the dry grass of the wild's interior to something firmer and darker, bare earth that held the day's cold differently, and the stars were bright enough that he could see the texture of it, the way it shaded from the ordinary brown-black of forest floor to something with a faint iridescence, the same color as old iron in low light. He came to the edge without any dramatic moment of arrival. The maw did not announce itself with a cliff or a drop or a sudden visual shock. It simply appeared, the ground ahead simply becoming not ground, the line between solid earth and open space arriving under his feet with a gradualness that was almost more disorienting than a sudden edge would have been. He stopped at the lip and looked down. The ravine was deep, deep in a way that was difficult to quantify in the dark, not because the dark concealed the bottom, but because the bottom seemed to be at an inconsistent distance depending on which part of his vision he used to look at it. The walls curved inward below him, which gave the whole thing the shape of an elongated vessel, narrow at the top where he stood, wider in the middle, and then presumably narrowing again at a bottom he could not see. The walls of the ravine were stone, or at least appeared to be stone, dark and dense and very old, but the stone had a quality of texture that he had not seen in any rock formation he had previously encountered, a fineness of grain, a smoothness that was not the smoothness of water-worn stone but the smoothness of something that had been created smooth. He crouched at the edge. He extended one hand and pressed it flat against the surface of the wall just below the lip. The stone was warm. Not warm in the way that south-facing stone holds the sun's heat into evening, warm in the way of something that generates its own heat, steady and deep, from somewhere inside itself rather than absorbed from outside. He pressed both palms against it. The warmth was even and continuous. He sat back on his heels and looked at his palms, which told him nothing visible but which still felt the warmth, residual, as though the rock had left something on his skin. He sat at the edge of the maw for a long time. It was very quiet, the particular quiet of a place that is not empty but is still, the difference between a room that has no one in it and a room where a person is sitting without moving. The maw was still in the second way. He had no logical basis for this assessment. He had it anyway. The note from Orin had said not to arrive before dark. It was well past dark. He looked at the sky and estimated several hours of night remaining, which gave him no information about whether this was the right time or merely an acceptable time. The note had not said to arrive at any specific hour after dark. It had said only not to arrive in the light. He looked at the ravine. The ravine looked back, or at least the quality of his attention felt returned. He said quietly, "I am here." He said it not loudly, and not in the particular way people use when they are calling for someone they expect to be at a distance. He said it in the way you say a thing when you are not sure who is listening, but want to be honest regardless. He had always had a preference for honesty over performance, and this seemed like a place that would know the difference. Nothing happened for a moment. Then the warmth he had felt in the stone intensified slightly under his hands, which were still resting on the edge, and from somewhere below in the ravine, at a distance he could not accurately judge, something shifted. Not a sound, a movement. The kind of movement you register with the back of your neck before you register it with your ears or your eyes, the kind your body knows is significant before your mind has caught up. Then a voice from below and to his left said, "You took your time." He turned his head. At the far end of the ravine's northern edge, a figure was sitting on a ledge that he had not seen before this moment, though whether that was because it had been concealed or because he had not been looking at the right part of the wall he could not say. The figure was male, from the build and the voice, and was sitting with his knees drawn up and his arms resting on them, in the relaxed posture of someone who had been waiting long enough to have fully settled into the waiting. "Orin," Cale said, "it was not a question." "You read the letter," the man said. "Good, I was not entirely certain it would still be there. The shelter gets used sometimes." "By whom?" Cale said. "By people who know about it," Orin said, which was either a complete answer or no answer at all, and Orin's tone suggested he was aware of this ambiguity and had chosen it deliberately. "Come down here. The edge is not the interesting part." Cale looked at the wall of the ravine. There were handholds. He could see now that he was looking, not obvious ones but functional ones, the kind that exist in rock faces that have been climbed repeatedly over a long period of time, worn slightly smoother at the grips than the surrounding stone. He climbed down. The descent was perhaps 6 meters. The warmth increased as he went down. By the time his feet found the ledge where Orin was sitting, the air around him was noticeably warmer than it had been at the surface, not uncomfortably warm but distinctly, genuinely warm, the warmth of a room with a fire rather than the warmth of a rock in afternoon sun. He found his footing and turned. Orin was closer now. He was perhaps 30, with a lean, angular face and dark eyes that caught the ambient light of the ravine, which there was more of than the depth should have allowed, a faint luminescence from the stone walls themselves, subtle enough that he had not noticed it from the surface but visible here, enough to see by at close range. Orin said, "Sit. You have been on your feet for 3 days." Cale sat on the edge of the ledge with his feet hanging over the further drop. He was not afraid of the drop. He was aware of it, and he was placing his weight carefully, which was the appropriate response to being on a ledge over an indeterminate depth, in a place he had never been before. He said, "You have been at my north border twice." "I have been in the area of your north border twice," Orin said. "The second time I came close enough to mark. The first time I was still measuring." "Measuring what?" "Whether you would notice," Orin said simply. "You noticed, most would not have. The wolves in that pack have been looking at the same territory for years and have stopped seeing it. You have been seeing it." Cale said nothing to this. It was accurate and did not require confirmation. Orin said, "Your father asked me to find you when the time was right. I have been watching your pack for 3 months, as I said in the letter. What I was watching for was whether you were ready." "Ready for what specifically?" "For what comes next," Orin said. "Which is a fair question and deserves a more specific answer, and I will give you that answer, but first I want you to do something for me." Kale looked at him. "Stand up," Orin said. "Step to the wall, put your hands on it." Kale stood. He was not the kind of person who responded to instructions from strangers as a reflex, but Orin's manner did not have the quality of someone giving instructions for the sake of demonstrating authority. It had the quality of someone who was about to show him something and needed him to be positioned correctly first. He stepped to the wall and placed his palms flat against the stone. The warmth came immediately, deeper than before, and this time it was not just warmth. It was something that traveled up through his palms and into his forearms with a specificity that was not the general warmth of ambient heat, that found particular places in his body and settled into them the way a sound finds the frequency it is built for. He stood with his hands against the warm stone and breathed and felt something happening in his chest that had no name in the vocabulary he had grown up with. He was shifting. Not the incomplete, frustrated halt-and-stall shift that he had been managing or failing to manage since he was 14. Not the partial shift that the pack's suppressants had left him with, the gray and undersized form that he had showed at trials, the wolf that fit the story the pack had decided to tell about him. Something else. It started in his hands and moved inward. He did not try to direct it or accelerate it. He had learned over years of failed shifts that trying to direct it was exactly the thing that stopped it, that the shift required a quality of release that was the opposite of effort. He breathed out and let it come. It came. Fully, without stalling, without the familiar grinding halt that had marked every previous shift he had attempted. It came the way water comes when a blocked channel is finally opened, all at once and without hesitation, with the particular relief of something that has been waiting to move for a very long time. He was aware, in the way you are aware of yourself within a shift, that what was emerging was not what he had been showing the pack for 3 years. It was not the scrawny, gray, low-statured form that Dren had laughed at and the senior wolves had dismissed. It was something larger, something older, something that his body had been holding, compressed and suppressed and patient for 3 years of medication and 4 years before that of whatever Vera had been giving him as a child, which he now understood had not been the harm he had briefly feared it was but the protection it had always been, a protection that had now, at the right time, been removed. He held the shift for a long time, his palms against the warm stone, the ravine around him quiet and attentive. When he shifted back, he sat down on the ledge without any particular drama and looked at his hands, his human hands. They looked the same as they always had, which was almost funny, given what he had just understood about them. Orin was watching him without expression, which was a specific way of watching that communicated awareness without reaction. Kale said, "How long have the suppressants been out of my system?" "Your grandmother stopped giving them to you 3 months ago," Orin said. "That is when I began watching. The timing was not coincidental." 3 months, he thought about the past 3 months. He had not noticed any change in himself, had not noticed anything shifting or building or accumulating, which was either a testament to how well the suppressants had concealed his nature or a testament to how thoroughly the pack had trained him to interpret any signs of strength in himself as irrelevant. He said, "She did not tell me." "She was waiting for the right context," Orin said. "She is a careful woman. She has been careful for a very long time." "She has," Kale said. He thought about the chest and the letters and Vera's garden and her brown coat and the herb tea and the way she had watched him without expression for 20 years. "She has been careful with my whole life." Orin said, "Your father has been careful too. More careful than you will perhaps initially be inclined to credit, given the circumstances." There was something in the way he said it that caught Kale's attention, a specificity, a knowledge of something that had not been said yet. He said, "You know my father personally." "I have served him for 12 years, Orin said simply. Kale absorbed this. Served was a particular word choice. It was not the word you used for an employer. It was the word you used for something more formal, more structured, with specific obligations running in both directions. He said, "What is his title?" The question was specific and direct, and he asked it knowing the answer was going to be a large answer, the kind of answer that reorganized the context of everything he had understood about his life up to this point. Orin said, "Lycan King. He has held the title for 23 years. He held it for the 6 years before you were born. He has held it for your entire life." The ravine was very still. The warm stone breathed its even heat. Above them, the sky was a strip of very deep blue studded with stars. the narrow sky visible from the bottom of the maw, precise and clear and very far away. Cale sat with the answer. He did not feel what he might have expected to feel, overwhelmed or frightened, or overcome with something that the occasion seemed to demand. He felt a kind of large, deep recognition, the same feeling he had had when he pressed his hands to the stone and felt something in him finally complete a movement it had been trying to make for years. It was not a surprise. It was the arrival of something that had been approaching for a long time from a very great distance, and now it was here, and the distance was gone, and the thing was simply true. He was the son of the Lycan king. He had been living in a fringe quarter room and failing trials, and doing the patrol shifts that no one else wanted, and being thrown into the mud by a man named Dren who had not the faintest idea what he was holding down into the ground. He looked at Orin. Orin was watching him with the same quality of attention as before, aware and without reaction, the expression of someone who has delivered a large truth before and knows that the delivery is not the important part. The important part is what happens after. Cale said, "Where is he?" "A week's walk from here," Orin said. "I will take you." He nodded once, then he said, "I want 3 days first." Orin raised an eyebrow slightly. "The pack declared the chase complete," Cale said. "They have filed their documentation. They believe I am gone." He paused. "I want 3 days in this place. I want to understand what I can do now that the suppressants are out and I have access to what I actually am. Before I walk toward my father, I want to know what I am walking there as." Orin considered this, then he said 3 days. Cale looked at the warm walls of the maw around him, at the glow that came from no source he could identify, at the strip of night sky above, at the ledge under his hands and the drop below and the depth of the rock, and the particular quality of stillness in this place that was not emptiness but attention. He thought about being thrown in the mud. He thought about the vote, unanimous, in the main hall with the high ceiling, and the benches full of people who had come to watch. He thought about Louise, looking up from the table, and the 15 seconds of silence, and the way he had walked out of the hall in the flat winter light and stood on the step and breathed. He was not going to spend those 3 days being angry. Anger was a tool. He had understood that for years. You picked it up when you needed it and you set it down when you did not, and you never let it pick you up instead. He was going to spend those 3 days learning what he was. He was going to spend them doing exactly what he had always done, paying attention, in the quiet and the patience that were his deepest nature, to everything around him and to everything he was discovering about himself. And then he was going to walk toward his father. And after that, after whatever that meeting held, which he would not try to predict because prediction before full information was how you wasted good preparation, he was going to walk back out of the wilds in the direction of a pack that believed it had finished with him. He had no plan beyond that yet. He did not need one. Plans he had found were most effective when they began from a position of complete information, and he was 3 days away from having that. He could wait 3 more days. He had been waiting his whole life. 3 days was easy. The warmth of the stone continued around him. The stars continued above. The maw held him in its particular stillness, and he sat in it without resistance, breathing, present, and for the first time in his memory, entirely himself. He had expected his father to be in a fortified place. He had built without meaning to an image of what the Lycan king would live in, constructed from the letters and from what he knew factually about how power organized itself in the wolf world. Power lived behind walls or at least behind borders. Power had guards and protocols and approached visitors from a position of elevation, physical or social, usually both. Power was housed in places that communicated, before anything was said, that what was inside was significant and that you were arriving at its threshold, not it arriving at yours. His father lived in a house. It was a large house, set against the base of a ridge in a valley that the surrounding terrain kept invisible from every approach except the specific path Orin had walked him along for 7 days. The house was old and solid and plainly made, with a wide porch and windows that let in the southern light, and a garden that was clearly tended regularly and with some care. There was a well in the yard, and a small outbuilding, and several large trees that had grown up close enough to the structure that their roots must have been under the foundation, which was something that happened only to buildings that had been standing in one place for a very long time. It looked like a home, not a seat of power, a home. He stopped at the edge of the tree line and looked at it for a moment. Orin said nothing. Orin had developed over 7 days of walking the useful quality of knowing when to say nothing. Then the door of the house opened and his father walked out. He was a tall man. That was the first thing Cale registered, and it registered strangely, because he had grown up with no frame of reference for his own height relative to his biological family, and the tallness of his father was information about himself as much as about the man walking toward him across the yard. He was perhaps 50, with gray beginning in his hair at the temples, and he moved the way Cale moved, which was the kind of thing you noticed when you had spent your whole life watching other people move, and had always been vaguely aware that your own movement was different from those around you without being able to identify why. His name was Aldrich. The letters had used it. Vera had used it exactly once, and only because Cale had asked directly and she had said it in the tone of someone handling something that required care. Aldrich stopped a few meters from Cale and looked at him. Cale looked back. They did both of this for what felt like a very long time. It was probably 10 seconds. The yard was quiet around them. The large trees moved slightly in the morning wind. The garden smelled of the particular late-season smell of things going to seed. Aldrich said, "You look like your mother." Cale said nothing. He had not expected this to be the first thing, and not expecting things when the unexpected arrived required a moment. Aldrich said, "I do not say that to diminish you. She was a remarkable person." "I know," Cale said. "Vera told me." "Vera tells people less than she knows," Aldrich said, "which has always been both her greatest asset and the most infuriating thing about her. Come inside." The house was exactly what the outside suggested, plain and real, and occupied in the genuine way of a space where a person actually lived, rather than a space that had been arranged for the purposes of impressing someone. There was a fire in the main room and a table with papers on it, not neatly arranged but in the organized disorder of a working table, and there were shelves along one wall that held an amount of material, books and maps and folders, that was the visual evidence of a person who had been accumulating information about a complex situation for a very long time. They sat at the table. Aldrich set the papers aside without stacking them. A woman Cale had not previously seen came from another room and set 2 cups on the table and left again without speaking or being introduced, which was enough of a social signal that Cale did not ask. He wrapped his hands around the cup. The tea was not the same as Vera's, not the bitter herb mixture he had grown up drinking, but something darker and simpler. He drank some of it. He was thirsty from the walk and from the morning cold. Aldrich looked at him across the table with the directness of someone who had given a great deal of thought to this moment, and had decided, in advance, to conduct it without preamble. He said, "You have read the letters." "All of them twice." "Then you know most of what I intended you to know at this point," Aldrich said. "What you do not know is the part I chose not to put in letters, because some things cannot be put in letters safely, and some things cannot be understood from reading about them." Cale set down his cup. He looked at his father. He thought about what it was like to look at someone who shared your face and your movement patterns, and presumably a large portion of the architecture of your thinking, someone you had never met until this week, and to try to calibrate the distance between information about them and knowledge of them. He said, "The letters tell me that my bloodline carries the authority of the Lycan king's line, that the title is mine by right of birth, that you arranged for my concealment specifically because the people who opposed your authority would have moved against me as an infant if my identity had been known." "Yes," Aldrich said. "The letters tell me that the pack I have been living in was chosen deliberately, that it was the kind of pack whose behavior would demonstrate, across time, the nature of the system I would eventually have to address." Aldrich looked at him steadily. "It was chosen because your grandmother was already living there, and because its leadership structure was representative of a widespread problem, and because its territory bordered the unbound wilds, which gave you an exit route when you needed one." Cale was quiet for a moment, then he said, "You put me somewhere difficult on purpose." "I put you somewhere safe," Aldrich said. Safe and difficult were in this case not separable. This sat in the room between them. Cale had been expecting to feel something specific at this moment. He had not been able to predict what, but he had been expecting the feeling to be recognizable. What he felt instead was complex in the particular way of truths that are simultaneously correct and insufficient. His father had made a decision. The decision had been protective. The decision had also resulted in 3 years of mud and laughter, and trial lists where his name sat at the bottom, and a culling chase into territory that the pack believed was fatal. He could hold both of those things. He was good at holding things that did not resolve neatly. He had been practicing it his whole life. He said, the pack's east border has a systematic gap. 2 senior wolves have been using a gap in the 3rd Wednesday rotation for over a year. The rogue wolf that came to the north border was Orin. Aldrich said, yes. You sent him 3 months ago, when Vera removed the suppressants. Yes, sir. The timing was because you believed the pack would move against me within that window. Aldrich said, I knew the pack would move against you within that window. Gareth's authority has been declining for 2 years. Dren has been building his own support base within the senior wolves. The culling chase was going to be used as a demonstration of Dren's authority over the senior group, a consolidation move, and you were the most available target. Kale absorbed this. You knew who I was going to be before I did. I knew what the structure around you was likely to produce, Aldrich said carefully. I knew what you had in you. I did not know you, which is a different thing. Knowing what a person carries and knowing who they are is not the same. This was more careful than Kale had expected. He had been ready for the version of this conversation that was about authority and bloodline and the formal transmission of power, the version that was organizational rather than personal. Aldrich was not giving him that version. He was giving him something that required more from both of them. Kale said, why did you not come yourself, when you decided I was ready? Because coming myself would have been me telling you that you were ready, Aldrich said. You needed to tell yourself, the maw is not something I planned. It was not in the original design. Orin told me you had gone there. He told me what happened there. He paused. I had been to the maw once when I was close to your age, under different circumstances. The experience was not something I could have described in letters in a way that would have meant anything to you before you had your own experience of it. Kale thought about the warm stone under his hands and the shift that had come fully for the first time. He thought about sitting in the ravine afterward and looking at his hands and feeling like someone who had just finished reading a very long book and understood, at the last page, why it had begun the way it had. He said, what happens now? Aldrich picked up his cup and drank from it, and set it down with the deliberateness of someone who has decided to say a thing, and is choosing the order of it carefully. He said, now I tell you what the title actually means, not the ceremony of it, the substance. And the substance is this: there are 43 packs in the territories I am responsible for. Of those 43, 14 are operating under leadership structures that are causing serious harm to the wolves they contain. Gareth's pack is one of the 14. It is not the worst of the 14. It is, however, the one you know, which makes it the place where you begin. He said begin, not finish, begin. Kale understood. The culling chase, the mud, the 3 years, the fringe quarter room, these were not the story. They were the first chapter of the story. The story was considerably larger. He said, what form does it take? The authority. The Lycan king's authority is recognized by the elder houses across the territories. It is not absolute power. It requires the documentation of lineage, verified by the elder houses, and the formal request of fealty from the packs under its jurisdiction. The documentation exists. It has been maintained by the elder houses throughout your life, under my instruction. The verification process takes 7 days. 7 days? Kale thought about what the pack was doing right now, in the settlement where he had lived for 3 years, in the main hall with the high ceiling, and about the people in the back benches of the vote session and what their quiet had meant. He thought about Louise, who had looked up from the table at the single most important moment in the session. He said, I want to understand the system before I address any piece of it. I want to know what the 14 troubled packs have in common. I want to know how the elder house verification works in practice. I want to know what you have already tried and what it accomplished and where it failed. Aldrich looked at him for a moment. Then he said, you sound like your grandfather. Kale said, tell me about him. That, Aldrich said, is a several-day conversation. I have time, Kale said. And they talked. They talked for 3 days without leaving the house except to walk in the valley in the evenings, when the light was long and the trees threw shadows that moved slowly across the ground, and the conversation moved through everything that needed to be moved through. The history of the title, the nature of the elder houses and their role in verification, the specific situations in each of the 14 troubled packs, the failures of previous attempts at formal intervention, the politics between the elder houses themselves, the informal networks that existed between packs below the level of formal authority. Aldrich was a better teacher than Cale had anticipated, not because he was clear though he was, but because he treated the conversation as genuinely bilateral. He asked questions as often as he answered them. He wanted to know what Cale had observed from his years in the pack, not in a general way but specifically, with the interest of someone adding data to an existing model and updating the model as each piece arrived. Cale gave him the data. He gave him the East Border Gap and the incomplete patrol records, and the way Dren managed his father's authority through social performance, and the way the backbench wolves at the vote session had sat in the rows that meant reluctance rather than conviction. He gave him Louise and the sharp upward look and the 15 seconds of silence. He gave him everything he had been storing for 3 years. His father listened with the quality of attention that Cale recognized because it was his own quality of attention, the full presence kind that missed nothing and stored everything, and did not perform its engagement but simply had it. On the second evening, Aldrich said, "What do you want to do with Gareth's pack?" Cale had been thinking about this. He said, "Not what they expect." Aldrich waited. "They expect punishment," Cale said. "They expect that when they find out who I am, the consequence will be the formal equivalent of what they did to me. They expect to be on the receiving end of force, because force is the language they understand, and the only consequence their experience has taught them to recognize." He paused. "I do not want to give them what they expect. I want to give them what the situation actually requires." "Which is," Aldrich said. "Reform," Cale said, "not the word, the thing. Actual structural change in how they organize themselves and how they treat the members they currently treat as expendable. That is harder to achieve than punishment. It requires more from me and it requires more from them, and it is less satisfying in the immediate sense. It is also the only thing that actually fixes the problem rather than just resolving my feelings about it." His father looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "I have been working on this problem for 23 years. "I know," Cale said. "In 23 years," Aldrich said, "I have found exactly 2 people who said what you just said and meant it rather than using it as a way of sounding generous while planning punishment anyway." Cale said nothing. "Your grandfather was one of them," Aldrich said. The third day, the woman who had brought tea on the first day and had not been introduced sat at the table for the morning conversation, and it was only as the conversation proceeded, and as she added information in the particular way of someone who had access to specific knowledge about elder house internal politics that Cale understood, she was not a member of staff. She was an elder house representative herself, resident in the valley by arrangement, which meant that the verification process had been anticipated and the necessary party was already present. He had not been told this on arrival. He suspected his father had wanted him to reach this conversation naturally rather than begin it with the weight of its implications already on him. He looked at her and said, "You have the verification documentation." She said, "I have held it for 18 years. "It is complete." "It is complete," she said. "It has been complete since you were 3 years old. We have been waiting for the appropriate time." She said "we" with the ease of someone speaking for a group whose membership and purpose were established enough to need no elaboration. He said, 7 days for the formal verification." 7 days, she confirmed. He looked at the table in front of him. He looked at the papers and the maps and the organized disorder of his father's working life, all of it pointing in the same direction, all of it arriving at this morning at this table, at the particular cup of tea that he had been drinking for 3 days without examining its taste too closely because there were other things to examine. He said, "Let us begin." Outside, the valley was very bright in the morning light, the ridge at its back still carrying a thin line of snow at the highest point, the trees in full autumn color, the kind of day that made the world look as though it had been made to be looked at. Somewhere to the west, 7 days of walking away, a pack that believed it had finished with him was going about its ordinary business unaware. He was about to spend 7 days completing a process that had been in preparation for 18 years. He was not impatient. He had never in his life been impatient in the way that people mean when they use it as a flaw, the anxious, forward-leaning kind that rushes things before they are ready. He was very aware that things arrived when the conditions for them were right and not before, and that the conditions for this had been building since before he was born, and that 7 more days was not a long time at all. He picked up his cup. He drank his tea. He let the thing begin. The elder House representative's name was Nora. She had held the verification documentation for 18 years with the particular composure of someone who had been entrusted with a significant secret long enough that the secret had become simply part of the texture of her life. She spoke about it without drama. She answered questions with the economy of someone whose knowledge was complete and who had given thought to how to communicate it clearly rather than impressively. She was perhaps 45, with reading glasses that she kept folded and set on the table during the morning sessions and put on only when she was examining documents, which was a detail Cale noticed because it suggested that her vision required no assistance for distance or conversation, only for the close work of reading fine print, which was itself a piece of information about the quality of her attention under normal conditions. He liked her immediately. He did not say so, he filed it. The verification process was not what he had imagined it would be, and he had not imagined it with much specificity, because he had understood from his father's letters that the details were not something that could be transmitted in writing without risk. What he had assumed was that it would be primarily documentary, the production of records, their examination, their certification by the appropriate authority. That part existed. The records were present, 18 years of them, maintained in a format that the elder houses used across all territories, and they were examined over the first 2 days by Nora and by a second representative who arrived on the morning of the second day, a man named Croft, who was younger than Nora and clearly her formal counterpart in the process, the second voice required by the elder house protocol to validate what the first voice confirmed. But the process was also not only documentary. On the third day of verification, Nora asked Cale to describe what had happened at the mall. Not the narrative of the walk and the arrival and the descent, not the facts of it, but the experience itself, the internal experience. She asked with the precision of someone who needed specific information rather than a general account, and she listened to his description with the same completeness of attention that he used himself when he was gathering something important. When he finished, she exchanged a look with Croft that carried an entire conversation in it, the kind of look that passes between people who have a shared reference system and have just received information that confirms something they both already believed but needed confirmed. She said, "The Moor responds to bloodline. It has responded to 5 individuals in the past 200 years. Your grandfather was one. Your father was one. The other 3 were members of collateral lineages whose claims were subsequently verified through the same process." Cale said, "It is a test." "It is a confirmation," Nora said. "A test implies the possibility of a wrong answer. The Maw does not produce wrong answers. It responds or it does not respond. In your case, it responded to an extent that Orin described to us as significant." He thought about the warmth in the stone and the completeness of the shift, the first full shift of his life. He thought about sitting afterward on the ledge with the glow of the walls around him and the stars above, and the feeling that was not victory and was not relief, but was the particular sensation of something coming into alignment that had been very slightly off for a long time. He said, "What does significant mean in context?" Nora said, "It means that the Maw held you longer than it held your father. Your father's first visit was perhaps an hour. Orin reports that you were there for 3 days. This was information he had not had. He had been in the Maw for 3 days, sleeping and waking in the hollow of the ravine with the warmth of the stone and the glow of the walls and Orin present or absent at intervals, and he had experienced it as a period of deep necessary stillness, not as anything dramatic, but as the right kind of time spent in the right kind of place. He had not thought about its length in relation to anyone else's. He looked at his father. Aldrich had been present for the morning sessions, but had not inserted himself into the verification conversation, which Cale had understood to be the appropriate protocol. The verification was conducted by the elder house representatives, not by the person whose authority was being transmitted. Aldrich sat at the far end of the table with a cup of tea, and the expression of someone who had known this conversation was coming, and was watching it proceed without surprise. He said mildly, "The Maw and I came to a much less extended agreement." Cale said, "Why?" "I cannot tell you precisely. Nora has a theory." He looked at Nora. She said, "The theory is that your particular preparation for this moment was specific in a way that your father's was not. Your father came to the Maw having grown up in the full context of his lineage and his authority. He knew who he was before he went there. The Maw confirmed what he already knew. You came to the Maw knowing nothing except what Oren's note had told you, which was essentially nothing. The Maw had to do considerably more work with you. This sat in the room for a moment. More work, Kale said. More thorough work, Nora said, without adjusting the phrasing. The difference in what the two of you arrived with required a different depth of engagement. What emerged from you at the Maw was not something that had been partially formed by a lifetime of context. It came from a very clean beginning. He thought about this for a long time. He thought about growing up in the fringe quarter room with no claim and no rank and no visible talent and no knowledge of who he was, and how the Maw had found all of that not knowing and worked through it, and how the working through had taken 3 days, and how in those 3 days what he had come out with on the other side was not certainty about external things, about title and authority and lineage, but certainty about internal things, about the quality of his own attention and patience and the specific shape of his own character. He thought, it gave me back myself before it gave me anything else. The 4th day of verification involved the examination of something he had not known existed, which was a physical record that predated his birth, a set of documents that Nora carried in a sealed case, and that were opened at the table with the care given to things that had been kept under specific conditions for a very long time. These were the original bloodline documents, not copies, not certified reproductions, the originals maintained by the elder house and marked with the formal seals of 3 houses whose symbols Kale did not know, but whose significance he understood from the context in which they appeared. He looked at these documents and at the evidence of his own name, his birth name, written in a formal hand on a formal document in a formal archive that had been waiting for him his entire life. He said, "My mother signed this." "The day after you were born," Nora confirmed. "Your father the same day. The witnesses were your grandmother and an elder house representative who has since retired." He looked at his mother's signature. He had not seen her handwriting before. It was neat and slightly forward-leaning, quick, the handwriting of someone who thought faster than they wrote. He recognized it. He had seen it on the note left in the cache at the shelter in the wilds. He looked at Oren across the room. Oren met his eyes and said nothing. He did not need to. He said to the room, "Oren wrote the note at the shelter." Oren said from his place near the wall, "I did." "You used my mother's handwriting." A pause. "She taught me to write when I was young. She was my teacher before she was anything else. I never lost the habit of her hand." Another pause, shorter. "I thought you might recognize it if you had ever seen her signature. Most people who have seen enough of someone's handwriting can recognize it even in a different context." Kale had not seen his mother's handwriting before. He had recognized it anyway, or had responded to it anyway, which might not be the same thing but felt in this moment like it was. He looked at the signature on the document for a long moment, then he looked up. He said to Nora, "Continue." On the 5th day, Croft asked him about the pack, not about the culling chase or the trials, about the structure of the pack, the governance model, the relationships between ranked wolves and unranked ones, the specific mechanics of how decisions were made and enforced. He asked with the precise interest of someone who was using the answer as diagnostic information rather than background detail. Kale answered fully. He described everything he had been observing for 3 years. The formal power structure and the informal one, the gap between them, the ways in which the informal power, Dren's influence, had been steadily superseding the formal authority of the Alpha over the past 2 years. The specific grievances he had observed among the unranked and fringe wolves that had never been formally addressed, the East Border failure and its persistence, the way the culling chase itself had been used not as a performance review mechanism, but as a political tool. He also described the backbench voters. He described Louise. Croft listened, Nora listened. He noticed that his father had moved from the far end of the table to a chair that was closer to the center of the group, which was a physical shift that communicated something about his level of engagement with this particular part of the conversation. He said at the end of his account, "It is not the worst pack. That is important to say. It is not the worst of the 14. It is a pack that has drifted from something it was once closer to under leadership that has stopped caring whether it gets further. That drift is real and it has caused real harm, but the material to work with is still there." Aldrich said quietly, "You have been saying this since you arrived." "I have been thinking it since the vote session," Kale said. The backbench wolves did not want to drive me out. They came to the session because the system required them to be there, and they sat in the back and they did not vote and they did not speak and they looked at their hands. That is not indifference. That is a population that has lost the belief that anything they do will change anything. He paused. That is recoverable. Nora made a small notation in her file. On the 6th day, he asked his father a question he had been building toward since the first morning. They were walking in the valley in the evening, the long light making the shadows of the trees into something almost geometric across the pale autumn grass. Orin was somewhere behind them, far enough to not be part of the conversation. The valley was very quiet in the way of places that have been quiet for a long time and have the quality of practiced stillness. Cale said, "Did you choose to put me there knowing that Dren specifically would be there, knowing the particular kind of cruelty that place would produce?" Aldrich said, "No, I knew the category of experience you would encounter. I did not know Dren would be the specific instrument of it." Cale considered this. He said, "If you had known, would you have made the same choice?" A long pause. Aldrich said, "I have thought about this question for 17 years, in the version where I did not know who specifically you would encounter. The honest answer is that I do not know. The structural choice was correct. You needed to experience the system from its least privileged position to understand it fully enough to address it effectively. That experience was necessary. Whether I would have chosen to give you a childhood that was deliberately difficult, knowing the specific shape of the difficulty in advance, I genuinely do not know. I think I would have wanted to protect you from the specific." He paused. "And I think protecting you from it would have cost you something essential." This was more honest than Cale had expected. He had expected a more constructed answer, the kind that a person with long political experience gave when they had worked through the justification of a complicated decision and arrived at a formulation that was defensible. This was not that. This was someone saying, "I made the call that I believed was right, and I am not certain I would make it again, and I am telling you that directly." He said, "It did not break anything." Aldrich said, "I know, Vera told me." Vera had told him. Cale thought about Vera with her garden and her herb tea and her readings of his face across 30 feet of trail, watching him get up from the mud, and the relief she carried home, and the 17 years of careful communication she had maintained with a man she had never let Cale know existed, because the protection required the silence, and she had understood that from the beginning. He said, "She has been reporting to you." "Not frequently," Aldrich said, "at certain points, when she believed something had shifted. When you were 14 and began asking questions, she needed guidance on how to answer without answering. When the suppressants were removed, when the pack began the formal review process. She told you about the vote session. She told me you walked out in the direction of the west light and stood on the step for 30 seconds and then walked away without looking back." "Yes." Cale said nothing for a moment. He thought about the step and the flat winter light, and the 30 seconds he had stood breathing the cold air and organizing himself before he walked to the fringe quarter to prepare. He said, "She watches me very carefully." "She has watched you carefully for 20 years, Aldrich said. "It is not surveillance. It is love in the form available to someone whose role required her to keep a distance." He accepted this. He had accepted Vera's particular quality of care a long time ago, even without understanding its full shape. Understanding the full shape of it now did not change the feeling of it, it simply clarified it. On the 7th day, Nora and Croft completed the formal verification process. The final step involved signatures, Cale's own, on a document that he read with full attention before he signed, not because he doubted it, but because signing something you have not fully read was a kind of inattention he was not capable of. He read it, he signed it, Croft witnessed it. Nora placed it in the case with the other documents and sealed the case. She said, "The formal verification is complete." She said it without ceremony, which was the right way to say it, because the moment did not need ceremony. It needed acknowledgement, which was different. He acknowledged it with a nod, which was the right response to an acknowledgement. Then she said, "The next step is the oath of fealty from the packs under the title's jurisdiction. That process is yours to conduct in whatever order and manner you determine is appropriate." He said, "I know the order." She looked at him. He said, "I start with Gareth's pack, not because it is the worst of the 14, because it is the one I know, Because I have detailed information about its specific structure and population and the internal tensions that already exist within it. Because starting somewhere you know thoroughly is more effective than starting somewhere strategically distant. He paused. And because the wolves who were in the back row of that vote session deserve to know, before anyone else, that the thing they felt reluctant about has a remedy. Nora looked at him for a moment, then she looked at Aldrich. Aldrich said nothing, he did not need to. Outside the house the valley held its practiced quiet, and the light was going to its evening angle and somewhere to the west, across the territories that were not yet addressed but that were now, formally and verifiably, his responsibility to address. Things were proceeding in the ordinary way of things that did not yet know they were about to change. He looked at the signed document. He looked at the sealed case. He looked at his father, who had spent 23 years working on this problem, and at Nora, who had held his documentation for 18 years without being asked to explain herself, and at Oren, standing near the door in the quiet way he stood near things. He thought about Vera in her garden, waiting for the news she had spent 20 years helping to make possible. He thought about the pack. He said, "I would like to leave in the morning." "I will walk with you," Oren said from the door. He nodded once. Morning then. The preparation was complete, the waiting was over. What remained was the moving, and he had never been afraid of the moving. He had only ever been building toward it. He came back on a Wednesday. The third Wednesday of the month, specifically, which was the day of the east border gap. He came from the east, which was the direction the pack had no eyes on because the two senior wolves who had been abandoning their shift for over a year had that night done exactly what they always did on the third Wednesday, which was turn back at the creek and file a clean report and spend the night doing whatever they had been doing for 12 months while the border went unwatched. He walked through the gap in the dark with Oren 10 meters behind him and stopped inside the pack territory and stood still for a moment. The air around him was familiar. The smell of the pines, the specific quality of the dark here, the way the ground felt slightly different underfoot from the wild's ground, more walked on, more known. He had spent 3 years walking this territory. His feet remembered it better than his mind did. He did not feel what he had expected to feel, standing again inside the border of the pack that had driven him out. He had thought in advance that there might be something sharp about it, something that landed like a wound finally pressed again. What he felt was simpler than that. He felt alert. He felt the particular quality of alertness that came when you were in a place where things were about to change and the change was in motion and could not be stopped or slowed, only managed. He walked toward the settlement. The settlement was quiet in the late night. Fires burned low in some of the buildings. The main hall was dark. The senior wolf housing cluster, the set of buildings where the ranked wolves lived, showed a single light, which was probably a night patrol preparation light rather than a social one. He did not go toward it. He went instead to the fringe quarter. He knocked on 2 specific doors and waited while the occupants woke and came to the door with the particular startlement of people being woken in the night, which produced a quality of openness that daylight hours and formal settings did not. He spoke quietly to each of them for perhaps 3 minutes. Both were wolves he had known well from patrol work, both fringe-ranked, both present at the vote session in the back benches. The first one, a man named Ray, who was perhaps 30 with a quality of careful silence about him that Cale had recognized from his first patrol shift with him as something other than timidity, listened to him speak, and then said without hesitation, "When?" Cale said, "Tomorrow morning." Ray said, "I will be there." The second was a woman named Clara, who had been in the pack for 8 years, who ran the Eastern Patrol schedule, and who maintained the patrol records with a level of precision that far exceeded what her formal rank required, which was one of the things Cale had noted in his long mental catalogue of the pack's human detail. She opened the door and looked at him and said, in the tone of someone who is not surprised, "You came back." He said, "I told you I was going to." She said, "You told no one that." "You knew anyway," he said. She considered him, then she said, "The East Border Gap." "Yes, I have known about it for 7 months," she said. "I have the records to prove it. I filed 2 internal complaints and both of them were declined by the senior patrol officer without review." "Dren," he said. "Yes," she said. He said, "I would like you to bring those records tomorrow." She looked at him for another moment with the expression of someone updating a model they had been running on incomplete information. She said, "Who exactly are you?" He said, I will explain that tomorrow. She said, you had better. But she said it without hostility. She said it the way a practical person says something when they have decided to extend provisional trust to a situation they do not yet fully understand, because the situation appears to merit it, and waiting for full understanding before extending trust was not always the available option. He did not sleep that night. He walked the territory instead, all of it, the whole perimeter, the paths he knew and the ones he did not quite know, the main settlement and the fringe quarter and the old structures at the east edge that no one used anymore and the proving ground at the western limit where the trials were held. He walked all of it in the dark, quietly and without hurry, the way you walk through a place you are about to change, giving it the full attention it deserved before you changed it. Orin walked it with him in silence. Orin was very good at silence. He had been good at it for 7 days. It was, Cale had come to understand, not absence of thought but the restraint of someone who had learned when their presence was most useful, and most useful was often without words. When the sky began to lighten in the east, Cale went to the east border. He stood at the gap, at the exact point where the coverage ended and the unguarded stretch began, and he looked at the ground. He looked at all the evidence of undisturbed passage that had been accumulating here for over a year, the tracks of the rogue incursions that he had memorized and never reported, the gap in the scent, markers that any competent patrol officer would have identified on a weekly basis if they had been walking the border instead of reading the reports filed about it. He thought about the report he had never filed. He thought about the decision he had made to keep the information private rather than give it to a system that would have buried it and used it against him. He thought about whether that decision had been the right one. He believed it had been. The information was safe with him. It had been used, not wasted. The chain of decisions from that first morning, when he found the gap, to this morning when he was standing in it, had been a chain that had led here, and here was where the information would finally be used correctly. He watched the sun come up. Then he walked to the main hall. The main hall was empty at this hour. He went inside and stood in the center of the space where he had sat in the chair during the vote session and looked at the room from this different angle, standing rather than sitting, in the center rather than placed before the council bench, and the room looked different from here, less enormous, more workable. He went to the council bench and sat in the chair at its center. He sat there for a while. He was not imagining himself in Gareth's role or performing anything. He was simply sitting in the chair to understand what it felt like to look at the room from it, because he would need to understand that before the morning was over. He was still sitting there when the first person came. It was Ray. He came in through the main door at the time Cale had named, which was an hour after sunrise, and he stood inside the door for a moment taking in the image of Cale sitting at the center of the council bench before he walked forward and sat on the nearest bench without comment. Clara came 5 minutes after Ray with a folder of documents under her arm. She sat on the opposite bench. She looked at Cale across the hall with the measuring quality of someone who had spent a sleepless night deciding something and had arrived at the decision, but was still processing what it meant. Others came, not many. 6, 7, 8 wolves from the fringe quarter and the border patrol ranks, the ones he had walked beside for 3 years and had observed carefully and had understood to be the population of wolves whose instincts toward fairness had not been extinguished, only suppressed by a system that gave them no mechanism for expression. He had not spoken to all of them the previous night. Some of them had heard from Ray or Clara and had come because they trusted those sources, and those sources had told them that the situation merited their presence. He counted 12 total. Not a large number. The pack had over 60 members, but 12 was enough. 12 was more than enough for what needed to happen in this room before the rest of the pack's morning began. He said, "Thank you for coming." He said it plainly, because it was true, and because the situation did not benefit from preamble. He said, "I am going to tell you who I am. Then I am going to tell you what is going to happen today. Then I am going to answer questions." He told them. He was concise. He used the same kind of language his father used, not the formal language of official documents, but the practical language of someone conveying real information to people who needed it in order to act on it. He told them about the bloodline. He told them about the verification. He told them that he had spent 7 days completing a formal process that had been in preparation for 18 years, and that the process was complete, and that what he was telling them was not a claim but a fact. He told them about the east border gap. He described it in full, including the duration of the neglect, the specific dates, the specific wolves responsible, the 2 internal complaints that Clara had filed that had been declined by Dren without review. The room was very still. Clara said, "How long have you known about the gap?" He said, "Since the 3rd Wednesday of my first autumn in this pack." She looked at the folder in her hands. He could see her calculating. That was nearly 3 years. He had known about the gap for nearly 3 years and had not reported it. He said, before she could ask, "I chose not to report it because reporting it to Dren would have produced the same outcome as your internal complaints. The information would have been buried, and the people who filed the report would have been penalized. I kept the information for when I was in a position to use it correctly." A pause in the room. Ray said, "You knew that whole time that you were waiting for a specific position." He said, "I did not know exactly what I was waiting for most of that time. I knew that I had information and that the system as currently structured would not use it properly, and that I needed to wait until the structure changed." Another pause. He looked at the 12 wolves in the room and said, "I am not here to punish this pack. I want to say that clearly, and I want you to remember that I said it now, before anything else happens today, so that when you observe what happens today, you understand the frame I am operating within." He said, "I am here to address what is wrong. That is a different thing." Oren, who had been standing near the entrance throughout, took this as his cue to step outside. Cale heard him moving, and then heard, a few minutes later, the sound of more people approaching the main hall from the direction of the senior housing cluster, and understood that Oren had delivered the communication that Cale had asked him to deliver at this hour. The senior wolves arrived at the hall in groups. Gareth arrived last, because Gareth always moved at the pace that communicated that things arrived at him rather than he arriving at them, and this morning was no exception. Gareth came through the door and stopped inside it when he saw the hall. He stopped when he saw Cale in the chair. He stopped when he saw 12 wolves from the fringe quarter, and the border patrol ranks sitting on the benches, and Clara with her folder of documents, and Oren near the entrance with the expression of someone who is performing no particular function, except being present as a reminder that the person in the chair has not arrived alone. Gareth looked at Cale for a long time. Then he looked at Dren, who had come in behind him, and who was now standing very still with the particular expression of someone who is rapidly recalculating a large number of assumptions. Cale said in the ordinary tone of a person conducting ordinary business, "Please sit down." He said it to the room. He said it without edge. He said it the way you say something to people that you expect will happen, not as a challenge but as a direction, and the quality of it was such that people sat. Even Gareth sat. Even Dren. He looked at the room once it had settled. He looked at every face in it quickly and completely, the way he always looked at rooms full of people, taking inventory. He looked at the wolves from the fringe quarter who were sitting straighter than they normally sat in formal sessions. He looked at the senior wolves, whose expressions ranged from careful blankness to something more complex, a recalibration in progress. He found Louise, who had arrived with the senior group and had taken a seat in the middle of the bench rather than the end where she usually sat, and she was looking at him with the same sharp quality of attention that had caught his notice during the vote session, that upward look that had happened in the one specific moment that mattered. He looked at Louise and she looked back and he thought, she already knows, not the details, the shape of it. She had been looking at the shape of it since the vote session, maybe before. He said, "My name is Cale, you know that. There is also a name I was given at birth that you do not know, and a lineage that this pack's formal records do not contain, and both of those things are going to be relevant to what happens this morning." He opened the folder that Nora had given him, the verified documentation, and he set it on the table of the council bench in front of him, and he looked at the room. "I am going to tell you what is going to happen," he said. "Then you are going to ask questions, then we are going to begin." Outside, the morning was continuing in the ordinary way of mornings. The sun was up and the air was cold, and the pack's territory was as it had always been. The pines and the proving ground and the fringe quarter buildings and the east border gap and the main settlement and everything else. Everything the same, and everything this morning about to be different. He had not come back to devastate this place. He had come back because devastation was not the answer to what was wrong here, and he knew what was wrong here better than anyone in this room, better even than the wolves who had been experiencing it for years, because they had been experiencing it from inside it, and he had been experiencing it from inside it while also being able to see it from the outside of it, which was the particular gift of having been treated as invisible for 3 years. He had been invisible. Now he was not. He looked at the room and the room looked back. He said, "Let us begin." Dren stood up before Kale had finished the third sentence. He stood up in the way people stand up when they have not decided to stand up, when the body has responded to something before the mind has issued the instruction. And the result was that he was standing in the middle of the main hall with no plan for what to do next, and the room watching him figure that out. Kale stopped speaking and waited. Dren said, "This is not a legitimate session." He said it in the measured, reasonable tone he used when he wanted to sound like he was being the adult in the room, the tone that had always worked on the senior wolves, because they had let it work for long enough that they had forgotten to notice it was a performance. He said it with the specific quality of a person who is accustomed to having their framing accepted, and who is not yet aware that this morning the room has changed. Kale said, "Sit down, Dren." He said it the same way he had said, "Let us begin," without edge, without challenge, as though sitting down was the obvious and ordinary next action and the only thing that would be happening. Dren did not sit down, he looked at his father. Gareth's face was doing something complicated that was too many things at once to read cleanly, which was itself a kind of information. Gareth's face was a face that was used to being the most important face in a room and was in the process of understanding that it was not. Dren said, "Gareth is the alpha of this pack. Whatever documentation you have produced does not supersede the authority of the alpha within pack territory." Kale said, "That is almost correct. The authority of an alpha within pack territory is recognized under the terms of the Lycan King's jurisdiction framework. The framework also specifies the conditions under which that authority is superseded." Nora was sitting at the far end of the bench, which was where he had asked her to sit before the session began, with the case of documentation in front of her. She opened the case. She took out 3 documents and set them on the table and identified each one by its formal name and registration number in a voice that was entirely businesslike, and that made clear in its businesslikeness that she had done this before and was in no way uncertain about the correctness of what she was doing. Gareth said, "Who is she?" Kale said, "Elder House representative. The Elder Houses certified my lineage 7 days ago. That process is complete and not subject to local dispute." Gareth looked at the documentation Nora had set on the table. He looked at it with the expression of someone reading a language they recognize but have not used in a long time, who is recalling the grammar of it with a feeling that is not comfortable. He said, "This requires a period of formal review." Kale said, "The period of formal review occurs before verification is complete. Verification is complete. What you are looking at is the post-review documentation. The review itself occurred over 7 days with 2 independent Elder House representatives in attendance and with Oren, whom you know, as witness." Gareth looked at Oren near the entrance. Oren was leaning slightly against the wall with his arms at his sides, and his face arranged in the expression he used when he was watching events unfold that he had anticipated. Gareth looked at Oren for a long moment, then he looked at Kale. Something was happening in Gareth's face that was not the anger or the defiance that the room might have expected. It was something more complicated and more honest than either of those, the expression of a person who has spent years maintaining a posture and is in the process of understanding that the posture was built on a foundation that no longer exists. He said slowly, "Your father." Not a question, a realization arriving in real time. Kale said, "Yes." Gareth sat back in his chair. He put both hands flat on the table in front of him. He looked at his hands. It was not the response Kale had planned for, because he had not planned for any specific response. He had planned for the range of possible responses and had prepared to address each of them. And this one, this immediate and apparently genuine recognition, was the one he had considered least likely from Gareth because Gareth's management of the pack had always proceeded from an assumption of his own unchallenged authority. And people who operate from that assumption usually defend it past the point of any reasonable defense rather than release it the moment a credible challenge appears. He thought, "There is something here that I do not yet know." He filed it for later. Dren said, "This is not legitimate," again, louder this time, with the volume of someone who believed that conviction of delivery was a substitute for the accuracy of the content. Kale looked at him. He said, "Dren, I am going to describe to you now what the documentation on this table demonstrates, and I am going to ask you to listen to the description fully before you respond, not because I require your agreement, but because I want to give you the opportunity to respond to the actual content rather than to the form of it." Dren's jaw tightened. Kale waited. Then he described it. He described the bloodline documentation and the elder house verification and the specific legal framework under which the title's authority was exercised and the specific conditions that applied to pacts within the jurisdiction. He described it in plain language, not legal language, which was a deliberate choice. Legal language was a way of establishing authority by making the authority inaccessible. He was not interested in inaccessible authority. He was interested in authority that was understood. When he finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Louise said, from the middle of the bench where she had been sitting with her hands folded in her lap throughout, "There is a dominance challenge protocol under pack law." He looked at her. She said, "A member of the pack may challenge any authority claim through the formal dominance challenge process. Gareth invoked it once when he took the alpha seat. Dren may invoke it now if he chooses." This was an interesting move. Louise was not saying Dren should challenge him. She was naming the process, laying it in the open, putting it on the table the way you put something on a table when you want everyone to be able to see it clearly. He understood. She was removing the option of pretending it did not exist, which was what Dren would have tried to do eventually, using informal means rather than a direct challenge because a direct challenge was visible and formal and documented. She was forcing the question into the light. He said, "Thank you, Louise." He let that sit for a moment, then he looked at Dren. "If you wish to invoke the dominance challenge protocol, that is your right under pack law and I will accommodate it." Dren looked at him. He was calculating. Kale could see it, the mental arithmetic of a person who was estimating the odds of a physical contest and arriving at a number he did not like. Because Dren had last seen Kale as the scrawny wolf who hit the ground at trials. He had not seen the maw. He had not seen the first full shift. He had not seen what happened when the suppressants came out and what had been compressed and contained for 17 years arrived all at once. Dren said, "I invoke the dominance challenge." He said it quickly, which meant he had made the decision in about 15 seconds, which meant he was going on the information he had from 3 years of watching Kale fail trials, rather than the information immediately available in the room, which was Kale's composure and the quality of Oren's expression, and the way Clara was holding her folder of documents like someone who knows she will be needing it shortly. Kale stood up. The dominance challenge protocol was formal but brief. It required a witnessed contest in the proving ground, with the pack present, and the outcome determined the authority of the challenger's claim. It was designed to take place immediately when invoked, which meant within the same session. They walked to the proving ground as a group. The whole room, senior wolves and fringe wolves and Clara with her folder and Nora with her case, all of them walking the path from the main hall to the proving ground at the edge of the territory, and other pack members emerging from their morning activities to follow, word moving through the settlement the way word always moved in a wolf settlement, faster than any message system. By the time they reached the proving ground there were over 40 wolves present, the same clearing where Kale had hit the ground at trials, the same mud at the edge, though it had dried since then and been raked flat by whoever had clean-up duty the week before, the same bench where Gareth had sat with his arms folded, the same trees. He stood at one edge of the circle, Dren stood at the other. Dren shifted first, which was the challenger's traditional right, and the wolf he became was what Kale had always seen at trials, large and heavy and built for a display of mass and power, the kind of wolf that communicated authority through size. He circled the edge of the clearing with a contained energy, looking at Kale across the circle with the assessment of someone who was confident in the gap between them. Kale shifted. He felt the moment in which the pack registered it, a collective stillness that was different from every other stillness that group had ever produced. He felt it with the part of his attention that tracked rooms and crowds and the quality of collective awareness. He felt them understand, all at once, that what they were looking at was not what they expected to see. The contest lasted 11 seconds. He did not want to hurt Dren. That was the genuine truth of it, and it shaped every action within those 11 seconds with a precision that was more difficult than simply winning would have been. He moved to establish the advantage, which took 4 seconds, and he moved to use it, which took 5 more, and at the end of that 9 seconds, Dren was on the ground on his side with Kale's hand at his shoulder pressing him down with a pressure that was firm and absolute, and not more than necessary. He held that position for 2 seconds. Then he released it and stepped back. He let Dren up, he did not stand over him. He stepped back to a neutral position and waited for Dren to get his feet under him and stand and complete the shift back, which took a moment, and he waited through that moment without display. Dren stood and looked at him. The crowd around the circle was completely silent. This was different from the silence after the mud at trials. The silence after the mud had been the silence of people deciding whether to laugh. This silence was not deciding anything, it was simply absorbing. He looked at Dren and said, quietly enough that only the two of them heard it, "I did not come back to take anything from you personally. I came back because the pack needs what it needs, and I am the one who can address it. You can be part of the address. Whether you are or not is your choice." Dren said nothing. Kale turned and addressed the circle. He said in the voice that carried across the proving ground to the whole group, "The dominance challenge has been completed. The record will reflect the outcome. I want to say something to this pack as a group before we go further." The clearing was very still. The morning light was full now, clean and direct. He said, "I lived in this pack for 3 years. I know this territory better than most of you know it, because I walked the sections that no one else wanted to walk, and I walked them with attention. I know the east border gap and the patrol record failures and the internal complaints that were declined without review. I know the wolves who have been working double shifts because the system that was supposed to support them did not." He paused. "I also know the wolves who sat in the back rows of the vote session. I know that the back rows are not where people sit when they agree with what is happening." Clara said from behind the circle, not loudly, "No, they are not." He looked at the crowd around the clearing. He looked at senior wolves and fringe wolves and the in-between wolves who fit neither category neatly and had always been the largest and least acknowledged group. He looked at Gareth, who had walked to the proving ground and stood at the edge of the circle, and had watched the entire 11 seconds with the expression of a man who had expected something and received something else entirely, a different thing, something that had reached him in a way he had not prepared for. He said, "Gareth." Gareth looked at him. He said, "I'm not here to remove you from the territory. I'm here to address the conditions in this pack. Some of what happens next will require changes to how authority is organized here. I would like to discuss those changes with you before I implement them, because you have been alpha of this pack for a long time, and you have knowledge of it that I want to have access to." Gareth looked at him for a long moment. He said, "Why?" Kale said, "Because good information is always worth having, regardless of its source." Something moved in Gareth's face. It was not gratitude, it was not relief. It was something more complicated, something that had a long history behind it that Kale did not yet have access to, which was the thing he had registered in the hall when Gareth had sat back and put his hands flat on the table. There was a history here that he did not know. He had filed it for later. He looked at the assembled pack. He looked at every face quickly and completely. He said, "I want to make something clear before we move further. What happened here 3 months ago, the formal removal process, the chase, I understand why it happened. I understand the conditions that produced it. I'm not going to spend any energy performing anger about it, because my energy is needed for things that are more useful than performance." He paused. "What I am going to do is fix the conditions that made it possible, and I would like to do that with this pack, not to it." The clearing was quiet. Then Ray said from somewhere in the crowd in his careful, measured voice, "What do you need from us?" He almost smiled. He felt it arrive at the corner of his mouth and he let it stay there briefly, because it was an honest response to an honest question and there was no reason to manage it. He said, "I will tell you exactly what I need. I will tell you specifically and clearly and without leaving any of it to interpretation, because interpretation was one of the things that went wrong here before and I am not interested in repeating it." He looked at the clearing, at all of it, at the mud and the trees and the bench and the people. "Come back to the hall. We have a great deal to discuss." They went back to the hall. All of them, even Dren, who walked in the group with the expression of someone who was still recalculating but had not yet landed on the new calculation, who was proceeding on the basis of not having another option, which was fine. Not having another option was a legitimate starting point. You worked with what people brought and you built from there. Even Gareth, who walked beside Louise, and who said something to her quietly as they walked, and who received from her a response that was 2 words and that Cale could not hear, but that caused Gareth to nod once slowly, with the weight of someone who has received confirmation of something they had been carrying for a long time. He noted it, he filed it. He would know the shape of it eventually. He was patient. He had always been patient. He walked into the hall ahead of the group and sat at the council bench and waited for the room to fill, and when it was full and quiet he looked at all of it, the whole room and every person in it, and he thought, this is the beginning. Not the end of 3 years of mud and fringe quarters and trial lists and laughter. Not the conclusion of a story about being underestimated. The beginning of the thing those 3 years had been building toward, the actual work, the hard specific work of changing a system that had been drifting in the wrong direction for long enough that the drift had become invisible to the people inside it. He said, let us begin. He had said it twice already this morning. He meant it the same every time. The first real conversation with Gareth happened 3 days after the proving ground. It did not happen in the main hall. It happened in Gareth's private room, which was a room Cale had never been in before and which was, he noticed, furnished with the particular spareness of someone who had been preparing for a long time to leave a place and had not yet gone. The room contained a table, 2 chairs, a bookshelf that was nearly empty, and a single photograph on the wall above the shelf. Cale looked at the photograph when he came in and looked at it again when he sat down, because it was old and showed a group of wolves in human form at what appeared to be a formal gathering, the kind that had stopped happening in this territory before Cale's time here. He said, what year was that taken? Gareth, who had come in after him and had seen him looking at the photograph, said, 26 years ago, before Dren was born, before I was Alpha. Cale studied it. He recognized no one in it. Then he looked at one figure at the far right of the group and looked again. He was looking at a man who was perhaps 40, with the particular upright stillness of someone who was completely comfortable with who they were, standing at the edge of the group in a way that could have read as peripheral but read instead as chosen. He said, my father was at this gathering. Gareth sat down. He said, yes. You knew him? I knew him, Gareth said. I knew him when I was young, before either of us was what we are now. He was a different man then, or rather, a younger version of the man he became. I was considerably less thoughtful than I became, though I recognize that the comparison is not flattering. Cale absorbed this. You knew who I was. Gareth sat back in his chair and looked at the wall above Cale's head for a moment, the particular look of someone reaching for precision about something that did not want to be precise. He said, I did not know for certain. I suspected from early on. There was something about the way you watched things. Aldrich watches things the same way. I noticed it within your first year here and I told myself it was coincidence. He said it without the quality of a person who expected forgiveness for the telling. He said it plainly. Cale said, you let it happen anyway. Gareth said, I was afraid, not of you, of the disruption of acknowledging what I suspected. There were things in this pack that I had allowed to go wrong over many years, and those things had become the structure, and if you were who I suspected you might be, the structure was going to be examined, and I was responsible for a great deal of what was wrong with it. He paused. That is not a justification. I'm explaining it because I think you deserve to know the specific shape of the failure rather than the general shape of it. This was more than Cale had expected from Gareth. He had been prepared for defensiveness, for the posture of a man protecting the record of his own authority. He was getting something different, which was more uncomfortable to receive because it required a different kind of response. He said, when did you stop believing it was coincidence? Gareth said, when you asked the direction, at the vote session. The question was Aldrich's kind of question, practical and specific in the middle of a moment where everyone else was performing. I heard him in it. He looked at the table briefly. And I knew at that point that I was letting you go into the unbound wilds and that I had told myself the wilds were unsurvivable because it was useful for me to believe that. This was a significant admission, and they both knew it, and the room held it without Cale needing to name it. He said, what did you tell Dren? I told him the chase was complete. I told him the documentation was filed. I said nothing else. A pause. I did not know whether you would come back. I did not know whether I hoped you would. Cale said, and now? Gareth looked at him directly for the first time since he had sat down, and what was in his face was not a comfortable thing to look at, but it was a real thing, an honest thing, the expression of a man who was at the end of something long and was looking at what his honesty cost him with the steadiness of someone who had decided the cost was right. He said, "Now I want to help you do what needs to be done here, if you will allow that. I know I have not earned the ability to determine what role I play in what comes next, and I am not asking for a particular role. I am asking to be useful in whatever way is appropriate." Cale looked at him. He thought about what Aldrich had said in the valley at the end of the second evening, about the two people in 23 years who had said reform without meaning punishment. He thought about this room, which was furnished like a room in the process of departure, and the nearly empty bookshelf, and the photograph of a younger version of this man standing at the edge of a group that included Cale's father. He said, "I need someone who can explain to the senior wolves what is happening without making it into a threat, someone they will listen to." Gareth said, "They will listen to me, not because I am alpha but because I have been alpha for 19 years and they know my voice. That is a different thing." "Yes," Cale said, "it is, and it is what I need." Gareth nodded once. They talked for 2 more hours that morning, with the spareness of the room around them and the photograph on the wall and the particular quality of a conversation between two people who have a complicated history and have decided that the complexity of it is less important than what needs to happen next. It was not a warm conversation. Neither of them was a person who produced warmth in professional contexts, but it was useful and honest, and it covered ground that needed covering. The changes to the pack structure were implemented over the following 3 weeks. The council was dissolved and rebuilt. The senior wolf hierarchy, the formal ranking system that had concentrated authority in the smallest group and left the largest group of wolves without any mechanism for addressing grievances, was replaced with a structure that Cale had spent the walking days between the valley and the pack territory designing in his head, drawing on everything he had learned from his father's description of the 14 troubled packs and the patterns of failure they shared. The new structure had a governing council with 11 seats. 5 of those seats were allocated to wolves from outside the senior ranking, drawn from the border patrol wolves and the fringe quarter population, and the unranked members who had been operating without formal representation for the duration of Gareth's tenure. The selection process was not appointment. It was a recognition vote, conducted with full pack participation, in which every wolf in the pack had an equal voice regardless of formal rank. Ray was elected to the council. Clara was elected to the council, and she brought her folder of documents to the first formal session and presented the East Border failure on the record, completely, with all the evidence she had been keeping for 7 months in the knowledge that it would be needed eventually, but in the uncertainty of when eventually would arrive. The record was formally corrected. The patrol reports that had covered the gap were noted as inaccurate. The 2 senior wolves responsible were moved from border patrol assignment to internal duties, not as a punitive measure, though it was also not comfortable for them, but because border patrol required a standard of reliability they had demonstrated they could not sustain. Louise was named senior advisor to the council, not because Cale had decided this, but because the council elected her, unanimously, in the first hour of their first formal session, which was the kind of decision that takes 30 seconds when it is correct. He watched it happen and thought, "She has been doing this work without the title for 18 years. The title is the least of what she deserves." He told her as much afterward, when the session had closed and the hall was emptying. She said, "I know that." She said it without false modesty. "I have been doing this work for a long time because I believed, incorrectly for most of that time, that the conditions around me would not support doing it formally. I was wrong about the conditions. The conditions were always potentially different. I did not push them hard enough." He said, "You pushed them the amount that was sustainable within the structure as it existed." She said, "That is a generous reading." He said, "It is an accurate one." She looked at him with the sharp quality of attention that had first caught his notice during the vote session, and said, "You could not have been more than 7 or 8 years old in that photograph." He said, "Which photograph?" She said, "Gareth's. I have seen it. I recognized your father's face. I should have recognized yours sooner." He said, "You recognize something. You looked up at exactly the right moment." She said, "I look up whenever something true arrives in a room. It is an old habit." He thought about the 15 seconds of silence when no one had spoken in his defense. He said, "Why did you not speak?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Because I did not know enough yet. I knew something was wrong with the vote. I did not know what the alternative was. I could not speak in favor of something I could not see the shape of. He thought about this. He said, "Would you speak now?" She said, "I am speaking now." She looked at him steadily. "I will always speak when I can see the shape of the right thing." He nodded once. The East Border Gap was formally addressed and the patrol coverage was restructured under Clara's management. The gap closed. The records were accurate going forward. This was unglamorous work, the work of schedules and accountability and the maintenance of things that should have been maintained all along, and it was the most important work of the 3 weeks because it was the foundation that everything else rested on. Dren was the variable that required the most careful management of the period. He was not removed from the pack. He was not punished in the formal sense. He was assigned to a specific function, patrol route maintenance, the practical work of maintaining the physical markers and equipment that the Border Patrol used, which was work he was technically qualified for, and which was sufficiently present and sufficiently unglamorous that it occupied him without giving him a platform. He did the work not enthusiastically but competently. Cale observed this without comment. The doing of it mattered more than the feeling about the doing of it. Feelings had time to develop. The important thing was the action. On the 14th day, Vera came. She came in the morning on foot, from the direction of the old settlement, with her brown coat and her walking boots and her braid close to her head, and she came through the main settlement without asking permission or announcing herself, which was entirely in character, and she arrived at the main hall where Cale was reviewing the first week's council session notes. She came in and sat down in the nearest chair and looked at him across the table. He looked back. He said, "You stopped giving me the suppressants 3 months before the chase." She said, "Yes." He said, "You told Aldrich when the pack began the formal review process." "Yes." "You have been in contact with him for 20 years. "More than 20 years," she said, "since before your mother died. Since before you came to me." A pause. "He asked me to take you. I did not take you because he asked. I took you because you were 4 years old and your mother was gone and the protection you needed required a woman who lived at the edge of a packed territory that already had a reason for her to be there. I was the right person. I did not need persuading." He looked at his grandmother. He looked at her the way you look at a person when you are seeing them fully, with all the information you have now rather than the partial information you had before, and the completeness of the view is different from the partial view not because the person has changed, but because your angle has. He said, "Thank you." She said, "You are welcome," and then she said nothing else for a moment, which was Vera's way of indicating that the topic had been fully addressed and they could move on. And they did move on into the specifics of the council and the structure and the 3 weeks of work, and she asked questions with the precision of someone who had been following the situation from a distance and needed the missing details filled in, and he gave her the details. An hour into the conversation she said, "I have a request." He said, "Tell me." She said, "The council has 11 seats, 5 of them from outside the formal rank structure. I have been a member of this territory for 20 years without a formal place in its governance, which is not something I minded, but which is something I would like to address." He looked at her. She said, with the calm of someone who is not asking but stating, "I would like a seat." He said, "The seats are elected by the pack." She said, "I am aware of the process. I am telling you that I intend to stand for election." He said, "You will win." She said, "I know that too." He thought about Vera at the table in the first full council session, with her folded hands and her old boots, and the expression that never read surprise, contributing to the governance of a pack that had spent 20 years not formally acknowledging her presence. He thought about how the wolves who had been at the outer edges of the pack's formal life would feel, seeing her there. He thought about what she would do with the seat, which he already knew, which was use it with the same precision and economy and absolute absence of waste with which she used everything. He said, "The next election is in 4 weeks." She said, "I know." She stayed for lunch and left in the early afternoon, and he watched her go back through the settlement in the direction of the old structure at the base of the slope, and he thought about the next 4 weeks and the 13 remaining packs and the work that was coming. The long, specific, unglamorous work of addressing a system that had been drifting wrong for too long. He thought about his father in the valley, and Nora with her sealed case, and Orin at the east border in the dark of the 3rd Wednesday. He thought about the warm stone of the maw and the first full shift, and the stars above the ravine. He thought about standing in the proving ground in the morning light and the 11 seconds, and stepping back and not standing over the person he had put on the ground. On the last day of the 3rd week, he called the pack together in the proving ground, the same clearing, the same trees and sky. He stood in the center of it, not at the council bench, not behind the table, not in any formal position. He stood in the middle of the open ground. He said, "The culling chase is struck from pack law." He had said this was coming. He had told Clara and Ray in the fringe quarter at the beginning. He had described the intention to Louise and to the council in the 2nd session. He had told Gareth in the conversation about the photograph. It had been moving toward this, visibly, from the beginning of the 3 weeks. But saying it formally in the proving ground, in front of the full pack, was the thing that made it real in the particular way that only public declaration makes things real. He said, "The vote on this change will be conducted by the council at the next session, as all formal law changes are. I am naming it here because I want it on the record, witnessed by this pack in this place, that this is coming, and that it is not going to be revised or delayed." He paused. "The culling chase was used on me," he said. "I want to be clear that this is not why I am striking it. I am striking it because it has been used across multiple packs and over many years to remove wolves who challenged uncomfortable truths or who held information that people in authority did not want on record. The law was not designed for that purpose. Its use for that purpose is the reason it is ending." The clearing was quiet. He looked at the assembled pack, all of them. The senior wolves and the fringe wolves and the in-between wolves. Dren in the back row with the expression of someone who was still in the process of arriving at a new understanding of their situation. Gareth at the edge of the group with his hands in his coat pockets, and his face carrying something that Cale had begun to identify over the past 3 weeks as the particular relief of a man who has been holding something heavier than he could comfortably carry for longer than he should have had to. He looked at Ray, who was standing with the quiet alertness that was his natural mode, and at Clara with her folder of accurately maintained records, and at Louise, who was looking at him with the sharp upward attention she had demonstrated was her response to things that were true. He looked at Vera, standing at the edge of the group in her brown coat, who was watching him with the expression he had spent 20 years trying to name. He named it now. It was the expression of someone who has been patient for a very long time, who has known a thing before anyone else knew it, who has carried it alone because that was what the situation required, and who is standing now at the point where the thing is no longer something that needs to be carried alone. It was the expression of having been right about something for 20 years, and seeing the 20 years finally arrive at their purpose. He did not look away from her when he said the last thing. He said, "The work is not finished. This pack is 13 of 14, the work continues. But what has been done here in 3 weeks is real, and it will not go backward, and no one in this clearing will go backward either, because I will not allow it, and because you will not allow it, and because the difference between those two things is smaller now than it has ever been." He stopped speaking. The clearing held the silence for a moment. Then Ray said, in his careful, measured voice, speaking to no one in particular and to everyone, "Good." One word, nothing more. But it landed in the clearing the way the right word always lands when it is the exact right word, with a completeness that made everything that needed to be said felt said, all of it, the whole 3 weeks and the 3 years before them and the 20 years before those. Good. He looked at the sky above the proving ground, which was the same sky it had always been, wide and cold and very clear. He breathed in. He had a great deal of work ahead of him. He knew the weight of it and he did not minimize it, not even privately, not even to himself. 13 packs remained. The Elder House verification was the beginning of a process that had no clean ending, only progress and the next thing that needed addressing and the thing after that. He had the patience for it. He had always had the patience for it. He had been building it his whole life, in the fringe quarter room and the east border gap and the trials and the mud, in every quiet observation and every piece of information stored without waste. In every morning he had risen before the light and gone to do the work that no one else wanted to do. In every night he had slept without difficulty, because difficulty was the environment he had learned to rest in. He had been patient. Now he was moving. And moving, for someone who had always been still in exactly the right way, was the most natural thing in the world.